outlook. Now, it's women's business that's on track to deliver its highest ever fourth quarter sales results. Shares right now, Abercrombie, they're up about 8.5%. And Lululemon raised its guidance for sales and earnings. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld has the breakdown.
The athleisure maker now expects earnings between $4.96 a share to $5 a share. That is for the fiscal fourth quarter. Previously, that range was between $4.85 to $4.93. Now, Lululemon also expects net revenue to fall between $3.17 billion to $3.19 billion.
Now, some investors, they expected a bigger upgrade, and that's why shares are a bit lower. They're down about 0.6%. And Crocs said that it expects record 2023 revenue after a successful holiday season that resulted in its market share gains for both its namesake and also its Hey Dude brands. Now, preliminary 2024 guidance is for revenue growth of 3 to 5%. We have Crocs up about 20%. And American Eagle Outfitters now expects fourth quarter revenue to rise in the low double digits, up from high single-digit increase previously. Its CEO said he's pleased with the momentum the company is seeing across its brands, which has continued into early January. American Eagle right now is up about 8%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is...
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, taking a look at these markets here this morning. The S&P is up 0.5%. The Dow's off about 0.2%, weighed down by Boeing. The story, though, NASDAQ, tech-heavy NASDAQ up 1.2%, 1,400, just about 14,700 on the NASDAQ. Yields come in modestly. The 10-year Treasury is down to 3.98%. That's about 6 basis points. WTI crude oil off 4% here, just above $70 per barrel. Gold also a little bit lower here, $2,033 an ounce. And Bitcoin up another 1.5% here, 44,950 for Bitcoin. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul and Jess. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has been in the hospital since the beginning of the year. The Pentagon waited 4 days to let President Biden know about it. Bloomberg opinion columnist Bobby Ghosh.
We're being told that the secretary's assistant was themselves sort of in bed with the flu, and this is where all the communications broke down. That does not strike me as a satisfactory answer, that if one person has the flu, the president is kept in the dark. That can't be right.
Hear more from Bobby Ghosh of Bloomberg Opinion on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast. A source says Austin's team understands its handling of the secretary's illness was unacceptable and can't happen again. Former President Trump taking aim at GOP rival Nikki Haley as the primary enters its last phase in Iowa. Now, Trump spent the whole weekend there before the January 15th primary.
People who fund Nikki Haley and Ron aren't working for your interests. They're working for the interests of other nations and themselves, and so are those two. Nikki would sell you out just like she sold me out. I mean, I'll never run against him. He was a great president. Why would I run?
Trump remains the Republican frontrunner with 1 week left before the caucuses, and Haley picking up steam in New Hampshire. She's now the #2 favorite behind Trump. Former Vice President Mike Pence says he is not endorsing any of the remaining candidates, at least not for now. The former GOP presidential candidate said on CNN's State of the Union he hopes Republican voters elect new leadership. Dr. Anthony Fauci set to appear today and tomorrow before the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. It's a 2-day-long interview. Subcommittee Chairman Brad Wenstrup, an Ohio Republican, says Fauci's testimony will help the subcommittee's investigation into the origin of COVID, plus what he calls scientific censorship and coercive mandates. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Jess.
Thank you, Amy. We appreciate it.
What do you got for us today, Jess?
So I had a story that actually ran in the terminal yesterday about how investors looking to buybacks to potentially keep the market afloat when you think about a big corner of the market, especially when you think about some of the biggest buying forces around when it comes to corporate buybacks. Not surprisingly, typically the big tech names are the ones that take up the majority of it. So Apple, Alphabet, Meta. Over the past 12 months, about over $160 billion in buybacks, though they have slowed slightly just because in the last 5 quarters, they came off after that peak in 2022, just given where rates were. And then also companies weren't taking on new debt quite as much, just given because of elevated borrowing costs, but that could potentially change this year. Also, a function that I like to use, NIM3, is where you can go and take a look at companies that are issuing new debt so far this year. So actually in the first 3 trading days, it was around 57 billion. So that was close to the record of 60 billion last year. And the reason that matters is you're seeing companies come back in, especially pensions, insurers, into the market. Typically that precedes strong buyback growth. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on to see how that spreads out in the coming years. But that's going to be a big thing. And especially when you look at BI Go, Wendy Song over at Bloomberg Intelligence, who I know you know, Paul, if you look at in their data library for corporate act and cash, they do have their buyback program and announcements. So far in the 4th quarter, there's been about 43 announcements. That is down from, if you look at the prior year ago period for that in the 4th quarter, the year earlier, it was around 55, but around 163 billion so far. But it's going to be interesting when you think about companies like GM, for instance. They had announced a 10 billion buyback program just over a month ago. And then obviously Disney also had a dividend for the first time in 2019.
Yeah, that's some great stuff. Some great data on the Bloomberg terminal. And Jess knows where it all is. She writes for Bloomberg News.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to talk technology. We're going to talk a little bit of Apple. Off to its worst start in a while. We've had some downgrades on Wall Street, kind of rare downgrades for Apple. People concerned about the growth of the iPhone, particularly in China. We'll check in with Anurag Rani. He's a senior tech analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. And then Nathan Dean, senior policy analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based down in Washington, D.C. I need to ask him, is our government going to fund itself? It's going to stay open? What's going on down there? He's all over that. And then Mark Newton, managing director and global head of technical strategy at Fundstrat Global Advisors, gives us his 2024 call. That's all coming up this hour. But first, let's kick everything off with Mr. John Tucker.
All right, Paul and Jess rally in big tech, sending stocks higher overall. NVIDIA shares among the best performers right now. That's up 4.6%. And then you have shares of Boeing keeping a lid on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's lower right now, the worst performing stock in the index. Data, the inflation print, we get that Thursday. That's the CPI. Also earnings season kicking off Friday. Jim Bianco of Bianco Research of the mind that, you know what, inflation bottomed a while ago, that market participants pretty much have got it wrong.
What they've priced in is this idea that we're on our way to 2%. And if we're starting to go the other way, I think that yields start going higher. Doesn't necessarily mean the Fed has to raise rates, but the idea that the market's got 5 rate cuts, that might be wildly optimistic.
Right now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average 109 points lower at 37,358. The S&P 500 22 points higher. That's up about 0.5%. We're at 4719 on the index. The NASDAQ 100 194 points higher. That's up 1.2%. And the NYMEX crude $3 lower, 70.75 a barrel. That is down just about 4%. You see this one? After the blown-off fuselage panel that triggered the decompression event for Alaska Airlines, one revelation seems to defy the laws of physics. One of the mobile phones in the cabin that had been sucked out of the 737 MAX 9 jet's cabin remained in functioning condition after falling 16,000 feet.
Wow.
This is the new generation Apple iPhone. It landed intact, unlocked, and with hours of battery life remaining on a Portland, Oregon roadside. This according to a post on X by a user calling himself, I don't know, whatever, Bates, who said he discovered the device. The screen showed an email from Alaska Airlines about a baggage claim for the flight based on Bates' photo. So,
wow.
That's a great ad for the durability of the iPhone.
I look at my phone like, you know, in a different way, and it just ceases to function.
I gotta say, I haven't had a cracked screen in a really long time for the iPhone.
Dropped mine in the toilet.
I dropped
Forget
mine
it.
Oh my goodness.
I actually didn't want it back, but
well,
I got a phone in the toilet story for you from the Bellagio in Vegas, but that's for another time.
We'll talk about that later.
John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube as well. So head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio.
What a way to talk about more about Apple.
I know.
After that intro
segue
from John Tucker.
I mean, and so all these analysts are worried about the iPhone sales in China, but I mean, I think survives a 16,000-foot fall. So that's a pretty good testimonial to the durability of the Apple iPhone. Anurag Rana joins us. He's in that tech hub of Chicago, Illinois, joining us here. Anurag, so I'm just looking at the stock for Apple. Yes, it's up over 40% on a trailing 12-month basis, typical Apple stuff. It's up 1.3% today, but it is down almost 5% year to date. And there are concerns, most notably on Wall Street, several analysts downgrading the stock, downgrading their outlook for the iPhone in China. Can you frame this out for us?
Yeah. I think the story that you mentioned is exactly what's happening with iPhone. It is an expensive product, and people are keeping it longer in their hands. So what that does is, if you look at the Apple's iPhone business model, it has a massive install base, let's say 800 million phones, and people replace it, let's say, about 3.5 years. Now, if that refresh rate goes to 4 years, that means instead of selling, let's say, 220 million phones a year, you're only going to send 200 million phones a year without gaining any new users. So really, that's what's happening on the refresh cycle, and I think that's really the bigger issue at this point. And as far as China is concerned, we know over there is some consumer weakness. And the second part is there is another local phone called Huawei, which hasn't launched a 5G version in many years, and they just came out with it, and that's really doing well. So I think because of those two factors, Apple may not have a good year in terms of total sales growth this year.
Well, walk us through some of these recent downgrades, especially last week, because Barclays was among some of the big firms that was taking a look and downgrading shares of that. Do you expect to see more of that happening, or do you think that's going to be more limited at this point?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I mentioned last week to Paul also, that when they reported their results on November 2nd, I mean, it was kind of clear that, things are not as rosy as, a lot of analysts were expecting. So I was actually surprised about the stock reaction at that point, which was essentially, it was down less than 1% after they reported earnings. I would have, expected a bigger drop, and I think, perhaps people wanted to keep, Apple in their portfolio because it had a good run for the end of the year, and they did some portfolio rebalancing. But from our side, no real new news has come in the first week of January that has changed our opinion. Things are going to be slow, but that was also the case back in November.
So what is the, strategic plan for Apple in China? Do they plan on introducing a lower priced iPhone, or do they just wait for their user base to kind of move up to the middle class so they can afford the existing phone?
I think it's the latter. I mean, China is an area where you are seeing the middle class becoming more and more rich. So if they're keeping their phone for slightly longer than they did before, let's say by 6 months or 12 months or even 18 months, then you will eventually see them upgrade. I mean, I know the phone's very durable from a strength, but the battery life does go out after a few years, and then you have to upgrade. So and you typically, when you are in an ecosystem, whether you are an Android ecosystem or an iOS ecosystem, there's a strong likelihood you're going to stick in that ecosystem and not change, back and forth because of, all the data that you have or all the pictures that you have in there.
Well, we have a story on the terminal from Mark Gurman, who we know breaks a lot of news when it comes to Apple, but he had a story that was about how Apple's Vision Pro headset is set to go on sale at U.S. stores on February 2nd. What I'm wondering is, does that help offset any sort of concern when it comes to the weakness in China? Is that enough to fix that?
No, we don't think that. And the only reason is it's going to be a lot of fun over the next 1 month, and people are going to talk about this thing a lot. It's pretty cool. But, when we look at this particular product, which is priced at, $3,500 or right around that, even in the boldest of scenario, you're going to maybe get 1 million shipments. That is the boldest I could say. We think it's going to be somewhere around 500,000 shipments. So that's, you look at that, that's less than $2 billion. And with Apple's revenue base of close to $400 billion, that's less than 1% of total sales. So it cannot move the needle for Apple to offset any slowdown that they are going to see in China.
Lastly, Anurag, what's the strategy for Apple in India, which could be obviously another huge growth market for them?
Yeah, I think India is going to be a very good growth driver for them over the, I would say, medium to long term. And the reason for that is there are about, let's say, 600 million plus smartphones in India. So, but when you look at the iOS market share of that, it's less than 5%. And the reason for that is it is a market that does not blend itself with a $1,000 phone or a $700, $800 phone. But over time, when the purchasing power of the Indian middle class improves, I think Apple's going to have a very good market share there. When we look at that tiny little market of less than 5%, Apple's doing really well there, but the total units are not, again, there to offset any slowdown in China.
All right, Anurag, thanks so much for joining us. As always, Anurag Rana, Senior Technology Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Let's shift gears a little bit and get down to Washington, D.C., because I guess we have to keep our government going, don't we?
We're at this point again here.
We're at this point again here. So when we get to this point where we have to kind of decipher what's going on in Washington, D.C., which is never easy, we turn to the professionals. Nathan Dean, senior policy analyst. He covers the U.S. government as well as anybody can for Bloomberg Intelligence. Nathan, what did we have? What happened over the weekend? Are we going to have another shutdown of this government? Where are we in this whole process of keeping this government open?
Yeah, so last week we had said that there was a 70% chance of a government shutdown starting on January 19th. And over the weekend, Senator Schumer and Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, came together on a $1.66 trillion package, essentially keeping the government funded through the rest of 2024. That's great news, but it slowly brings our odds of a shutdown down, but not by much. The reason being is it's great that they have this number, but there's all these other pieces that are going on: border security, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan aid, and et cetera, and with time ticking. Now, the thing to note is that on January 19th, only 4 out of the 12 appropriation bills shut down. So this is like the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, and Agriculture. The rest of them, like Defense and Homeland Security, shut down on February 2nd. Now, the House Freedom Caucus isn't really thrilled with this idea of this package and so forth like that. And Speaker Johnson now has a choice. Does he try and get this package through using Democratic votes? This is something that Kevin McCarthy did before he was essentially taken out of office. Or do you try and work out a deal within his own party? So we're sticking with our 70% chance of a shutdown come January 19th, but the odds of a long-term shutdown have dropped considerably, because I'm actually looking at red lines on the terminal right now. It looks like senators are saying we're getting close to a border deal.
Walk us through those 2 funding deadlines, because you did mention January 19th, but I believe there's also something we need to focus on February 2nd as well.
Yeah, that's right. So there's essentially 3 deadlines here that matter. The first one is January 19th. Now, 4 out of the 12 appropriation bills will shut down. So if you're the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy, you can't go to work. Now, the market impact of this, extremely light. Even if it was a full government shutdown, market impact is light. But in this case, if you're a commodity trader and you're using certain reports over the Department of Agriculture, those reports could be delayed. Now, if Speaker Johnson says we can't get a deal, I'm not going to go against my party, we're going to partially shut the government down, then we go to February 2nd. February 2nd is the 8 of the 12, includes Homeland Security, Defense, Treasury, everybody else. Now, again, if you have a shutdown, the market impact is light. Those reports, and especially Federal Reserve reports at this point, start to get delayed. Now, even defense contractors usually aren't all that impacted by a long-term shutdown or a short-term shutdown. So again, the market impact here. But then the ultimate deadline is April 30th. And this is where, if the government is still operating under a continuing resolution, meaning that they haven't filled their package for all of 2024, we have a sequester. And it's a 1% sequester over 2023 levels. Nobody in Washington wants that. So what we think is going to happen is we think there's a chance of a high chance of this shutdown on January 19th, a partial shutdown. They may resolve it by February 2nd. If not, they may kick the can, but ultimately they will resolve something before April 30th, because that's when the scary sequester headline comes in. Washington just really wants to avoid that.
And I hate to even layer on top of this, but what is election year calculus?
That's what I was about to ask as well.
What does that mean? My head can't even do the gymnastics to think about who wins and who loses here.
So, we're actually telling our clients, we have a great report talking about the election that we just put out, but there's a lot of time before the election. And so you're going to see headlines like Iowa and New Hampshire and so forth. But ultimately, what the polls suggest is that it's going to be President Biden versus President Trump. Both individuals that we have history of being able to track policies and goals and so forth like that. So when it comes to the market, I think when it comes to the Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina primaries, markets can sort of just keep this in the back of your mind. It's not something you actively need to start thinking about. But once it solidifies, and let's just say it is President Trump versus President Biden, then we're going to have to start looking at, okay, what is actually going to happen? Now, you also have the scenario of, does the House go to the Democrats or stay with the Republicans? So things like the Inflation Reduction Act from 2025 or trade, tax. I mean, we could have an entire segment on tax. But what I'm saying here is there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, a lot of stuff the markets need to pay attention to. I just think you have probably another 3 or 4 months until you really need to start digging into it.
So really, the April deadline that you were talking about, is that the most important one?
Yeah, so I mean, even just in terms of a scary headline, I'd say the April 30th deadline is the most important. Keep in mind, debt ceiling. If there's any fixed income traders out there, please note the debt ceiling is not during this election cycle. It's been pushed off to beyond the elections. Now, there are other pieces of legislation that needs to pass out there, like flood insurance program and so forth, like FAA reauthorization. And the reason why I'm bringing up these smaller bills is that these provide opportunities to attach things to these bills and for certain parties to use them as leverage. Perfect example is, and this is why we have it during the government shutdown fights, is that if the House Freedom Caucus wants to try and advance some of their goals and they can't get the Senate or the White House to agree to it, well then why don't you attach it to the government shutdown and leave town and then try and use it as leverage. So you're going to see a lot of scary headlines over, say, the next 3 to 6 months. But again, the impact to the markets is really light.
So you're down in D.C., and it gets crazier and crazier every time we look down there, Nathan. Our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, apparently is in the hospital, and apparently that wasn't well communicated to the folks that should have heard about it, namely the president and the administration. Is there any talk down in D.C. about whether there might be a change? I know you're not a political reporter, but whether there might be a change there, and if so, are any of the defense companies, are you hearing anything from them?
So, you know, the reporting that I've seen from Bloomberg News said that it's not, there's not at this point going to be a change of anything. I mean, this is actually could be, you know, take it as like a wake-up call for the White House, if you will. I mean, there's somewhere that the process broke down here. I mean, obviously, these things shouldn't happen. And so if the White House comes back and says, right, we're in an election year, we need to make sure that these things don't occur, then the optimistic view is maybe they figure this out. Now, from the defense company perspective, I think ultimately they're more concerned about what is the ultimate funding level that gets through. For example, the Ukraine funding. President Biden has been shooting for around $43 billion in Ukraine funding. Our great analyst, Will Lee, put a note saying that if we were to get that $43 billion, those defense contractors are looking at a 1 to 2% increase in revenue sales over 1 to 2 years. So ultimately, the negotiations in Congress are more important for those defense companies than I think some of the internal politics of what's just happening at the White House.
We only have about a minute left, but what do you think are the biggest sticking points when it comes to these negotiations right now?
Ultimately, I think it just comes to Speaker Mike Johnson. Look, I think that you can come to an agreement on Israel. You can come to an agreement on Ukraine. You know, if the red lines on the terminal are correct, you know, we could potentially come to an agreement on border security. That's all great. But ultimately, Speaker Mike Johnson has 30 to 50 members of his own party that probably won't ever vote for this. So the question is, will Speaker Mike Johnson put to the floor a vote on something that he needs Democratic votes and loses the 30 to 50 members? This is something that pushed Kevin McCarthy out of a job. And so ultimately for Mike Johnson, this is a question of what does he want his speakership to be? And we'll probably find out on January 19th.
Nice. Boy, he's good.
He always has the information.
Nathan, I don't know how you do it, buddy, but we appreciate you kind of clearing it up for us a little bit. Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst for the U.S. Government for Bloomberg Intelligence, all over
Always
stuff.
Always got the info.
I mean,
for us.
I love he's out there with like this, percentages. This thing's going to work. This not going to work. He's out there putting out some
crunching it all for us.
Good analysis and sticking his neck out there. So we appreciate that. So again, got a couple of dates to pay attention to. January 19th, certainly the first one. S&P 500, it's up 0.5%. The Dow's off 0.2%, and the Nasdaq up 1.1%. I'm going to call out crude oil. It's down 4.4%. For WTI crude oil, it's now $70.50. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now from Lisa Mateo.
There, Paul. The FAA has temporarily grounded Boeing 737 MAX 9 jets for safety checks. And this is after a panel blew off during an Alaska Airlines flight on Friday. Bloomberg Intelligence airline analyst George Ferguson suspects it's an isolated problem.
We're not finding plugs blowing out of other aircraft. We're not finding them blowing out of other Dash 9s. And so to me, when I look at, the piece that fell away, the cleanness of that, of what fell away from the airplane, it looks to me like someone on a production line didn't install all of the fasteners that needed to be installed to keep that panel in place.
Boeing is down more than 6.5%. Now, shares of its supplier Spirit AeroSystems, those are also lower. They're down about 7%. Now, this news also affecting two carriers here in the U.S. that use those specific jets. We're talking about United and Alaska Airlines. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman has more on that.
United has about 79 MAX 9 jets, Alaska 65. And Monday flights are also being canceled after a weekend where there were 270 flights canceled for United, 163 for Alaska. That amounts to about 1/5 of Alaska's overall flights. Alaska saying these groundings could continue through at least midweek.
Alaska Airlines down 1.5%. United is up about 2%. And Sony Group planning to call off the merger pact of its India unit with Z Entertainment Enterprises. Sources tell Bloomberg it's due to a standoff over whether Z's CEO would lead the merged entity as he's facing a regulatory probe. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom. This is Bloomberg Business Flash. 5 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 higher right now. You have technology in the lead, the best performer with information technology. And that's where you're going to find shares of NVIDIA. They're up about 4.5%. There's a report NVIDIA starting a China-focused AI chip in the second quarter. Right now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average down about 80 points. Boeing and Chevron remain the biggest drags on the Dow right now. The S&P 500 up just about 25 points. That's a rise of 0.5%. We're at 4721 on the index. The NASDAQ 100 is up 195 points. That is up right now 1.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Jess and Paul.
Thank you, John Tucker. We appreciate it. I want to get straight to our next guest, Mark Newton, who is Global Head of Technical Strategy over at Fundstrat Global Advisors. And I have to point out, he's been very spot on with his calls. So if you rewind and think back to the fall of 2021, this was right before the NASDAQ 100 peaked out, as well as the Russell 2000, and of course a couple months before what happened with the S&P 500 hitting ultimately its record that was about 2 years ago. But he was already concerned about the trajectory of stocks well before a lot of those geopolitical issues happened at the beginning of that year, and then also had adjusted. He had around a 4,700 price target for the S&P 500, so pretty close there, where the S&P 500 finished the year. But Mark, thanks for joining us. It's always great speaking with you. I want to get your thoughts firstly on what's your outlook for equities this year.
Thank you, Jess. Happy New Year to everybody. And I am very constructive on equities this year, actually. I do believe the S&P will get up to 5175. In general, it should be a lot easier year for many investors than last year. I know last year was largely, tech dominated for most of the year, and the broader market largely, it took some time for many other sectors to play catch up. And I think we did see that in the fourth quarter. My view is that this year should allow for a more broad-based rally in many of these other sectors like financials and healthcare. And I think the beginning of the year certainly has seen a little bit of a drawdown in some of the former leaders for last year, certainly a very big period of mean reversion. But my bigger call is that I think bond yields are going to drop this year, likely down to 3.25% on the 10-year, and that markets should have a very good year, and that, any sort of recession, I think, is going to be postponed at least until 2025.
So, Mark, you bring up a good point there. I mean, when you think about 2023's performance, up until kind of October, it was extraordinarily narrow. And I know for folks that think about the health of the market, that's not very healthy because the breadth of the market advance wasn't great. They got a little bit better there in the fourth quarter. How do you feel about kind of the breadth that we're seeing in the market these days?
Well, I think the breadth recently has been, at least over the last couple of months, has gotten almost so good that it merits, thinking that we probably will see some consolidation in the first quarter of this year. I don't think we can just continue to go straight higher. We have nearly 90% of all stocks right now above their 50-day moving averages and about 75% above their 200-day. But important to mention that we've seen one of the quickest moves from a very low level of breadth to a very high level of breadth in a very short period of time. And for me, that's very encouraging towards thinking that, we're seeing this broader based recovery in risk assets, still at a time when a lot of the institutional investors are not as enthusiastic about risk assets gauged by cash on the sidelines or just the ongoing wars that we're seeing and a lot of reasons to be concerned. But in general, it's a healthy time. I just think we probably need some backing and filling.
With what you're seeing, especially underlying when you're looking at, say, small caps that have taken off, especially over the past couple of months after getting hit hard, not just last year, but over the past couple of years. And then, of course, bank stocks, which had gotten hit hard last spring, but had seen obviously a lot of improvement over the past 2 months. Do you think that still has legs there? Like, what are the technicals telling us when it comes to the small caps and some of those value corners of the market like banks?
Yeah, thanks. I do think that small caps have a window for outperformance this year. A lot of that should be predicated on rates pulling back further, which can be helpful to this area. As you know, and most investors know, the small cap sector has been a very difficult spot over the last decade. It's important that we saw a brief period in 2020 when they showed very good outperformance, but largely it's been a very big time for large cap growth. And I think that initially, as we see rates start to really accelerate to the downside, that's going to be a time when small caps outperform, which is probably a 6 to 8 month window this year where we see some decent outperformance. Financials, that is sort of a mixed picture, and I'm not bullish on financials for the year. I'm more neutral, but I do think that they can work. We've seen the yield curve get a lot less inverted. And I think, through the stress tests we've had over the last decade that, the balance sheets are in very good shape, but, still tough for a lot of these regional banks. It's going to take some time. We've seen a very good move off the lows. I would argue that's probably not the best area for immediate outperformance, but certainly I'd be a big buyer on the backing and filling.
So, Mark, the extent of my technical analysis is the RSI function.
We know that's his favorite.
So, I mean,
Paul's point, though, with RSI, because I know you have your way of looking at technicals, but a lot of traders, it's not just a one day when they're looking at charts. They look at weekly, they look at monthly. I think a lot of people, especially coming into this year, to Paul's point, they kept talking about, hey, these overbought levels. But a lot of times when I'm speaking with technicians, they're viewing it from other lenses as well. So even though you could see RSI, even though it's not still above 70 at this point, but if you're looking at the S&P or the NASDAQ 100, it could stay above 70 for a while, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right?
Yeah, that's a very important comment, and I think it's really key to really measure investors' time frame of investment, their risk tolerance, and generally looking, you'll hear traders say, well, it's oversold, it's overbought, but a lot of times they're mentioning very, very short-term time frames. And if you look at the larger periods where equities have peaked or bottomed, it's come when, weekly or monthly RSI have gotten very overbought or oversold. And right now we're sort of in a pocket where momentum has been very positive, but yet, the recent drawdown we've had in recent weeks has actually caused RSI to pull back from those overbought levels on a daily and actually a weekly basis. So, and I'm a little more encouraged, I think for the year, just because I don't view momentum as being all that overbought per RSI. But the divergences are really the most important, way to use technical analysis in my view and use momentum. It's not that when things get to overbought, you want to sell. It's really when you see repeated stabs at new highs in prices where momentum does not follow and starts to move down. And that can be sometimes a warning sign. And really in both directions. Price moves lower. You want to watch for weekly or monthly RSI to hold and not make new lows. These divergences are really sort of the bread and butter of how many technical analysts really use, RSI.
How about volume? What's the volume you've been telling in the equity markets and the bond markets recently?
Well, volume certainly is very important. I would view more so on a single stock basis than how I look at the markets. There's just a lot of ways to measure volume, and particularly all the different, we've heard about these record inflows, and that would seem to be a very positive thing, but yet markets have been selling off. So volume is probably, not as helpful for day-to-day decisions for investors when looking at the broader indices. But certainly you want to see breakouts of stocks happen on good volume and, pullbacks happening on lesser volume. Those can all be very important things to concentrate on.
I know something too when it comes to volume can be tricky if you're looking at the ARMS index, or some people when they follow technicals trend. I know it spiked above 3.5 actually on December 20th, but that can be a little tricky when you're looking at something like that. Is it more just a day-to-day thing that it's more useful than maybe more forward-looking? Or?
Yeah, that's a great point, because the trend is very useful, and we won't need to go into a lot of depth here, but a lot of it's about the advances to decliners divided by the advancing volume minus declining volume. In general, when you have very high volume on the downside, oftentimes that can signal inflection points, particularly after a lengthy decline. If all of a sudden you see people rushing in to sell and the declining volume is very, very heavy, that can be important in marking bottoms. But I would argue precisely the opposite is also true. If you have a high trend after an advancing period in stocks, where a huge rally and then a very high trend on a reversal, for me, that oftentimes is a warning sign. But statistically, look, whenever you look at these things going out 3 months, 6 months and try to measure them, they all say that the market's going to go higher, and that's just the upward trending nature of the market. So it's more for me on a short-term basis and just looking at that trend. When you see, trend readings being above 2.5, that can be very important, literally in both directions.
All right, very good. Mark Newton, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Mark Newton, he's Global Head of Technical Strategy at Fundstrat Global Advisors. Tom Lee and some guys over there. They got some smart people over there.
Oh, yeah. No, they're bringing on a lot of smart talent.
Yeah, actually. So, again, we don't talk technicals as much as maybe we should have, but for a lot of people.
I cover technicals a lot for the U.S. equities team.
You do. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're right about them.
I do.
Oftentimes over the weekend, right?
I do.
Isn't that funny? And then somehow we talk about them on the radio the next week. Isn't that funny? That works.
I know you love it, Paul.
Tying it all together.
She plugs herself. She talks up her own book.
Yeah, exactly. That's
well, I mean, I'm right. But we've got a great U.S. equities team out there, so I bring all my buddies on to talk about what they're covering.
Exactly. All right, good stuff there. S&P 500 up 0.5%, the Dow off 0.2%, and NASDAQ up 1.2%. Yields coming in, 10-year Treasuries down about 7 basis points, 3.97% on your 10-year Treasury. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. The odds of a partial government shutdown later this month have eased up a bit. Congressional leaders have reached a deal on a top-line spending level for this fiscal year. Bloomberg Government Congress reporter has more from Washington.
They agreed to spend about $1.6 trillion for the current fiscal year that ends September 30th. And that allows appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate to start actually drafting these bills and hopefully pass them before that shutdown deadline, not just obviously next week, but also on February 2nd.
Bloomberg Government Zach Cohen reports Republicans also agreed to some budget moves that Democrats demanded to prevent immediate cuts to domestic agency budgets. Conservatives call those moves gimmicks, and it could cost their support. Israel has reportedly killed a Hezbollah commander in South Lebanon amid rising concerns the war with Hamas could escalate into a wider Middle Eastern conflict. Hamas also blames Israel for the killing of a top leader in Beirut last week, which Hezbollah responded to by firing missiles into Israel. The New York Times is reporting that Israel has begun a new and less intense phase of its invasion of Gaza. The Pentagon is facing bipartisan criticism for waiting days to disclose that the defense secretary has been in the hospital since the start of this year. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Qatar said he also had not been aware of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's medical issues and had just spoken with him last weekend.
It's been a highlight of my service to be able to serve alongside him, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing him fully recovered and working side by side in the year ahead.
Sources tell Bloomberg News a series of errors led to the lack of disclosure, including confusion over Secretary Austin's wishes and his chief of staff also falling ill. The White House has said that if the Secretary of Defense resigns, they will not accept it. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. A rally in big tech sending stocks higher for the most part. You have shares of NVIDIA among the best performers. Shares of Boeing, on the other hand, keeping the Dow lower. It's the worst performing stock in that index. Among the other things investors are watching for, the U.S. inflation print. We're going to get that Thursday. And then, of course, earnings season that kicks off Friday with the financials. Meantime, Barton Crockett, analyst at Rosenblatt Securities, sees muted growth ahead for Apple, but otherwise is positive on tech stocks.
You're seeing explosive margin improvement at Amazon, at Meta, at Pinterest, at Spotify. You know, those, I think, are much more interesting opportunities in this environment.
You have shares of American Eagle right now up over 8%. The apparel retailer projecting a fourth quarter revenue that will be low to double-digit year-over-year boost from its previous view. Right now, the S&P 500 up 24 points. That's a rise of 0.5%. 47.22 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 87 points. And the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 right now 193 points higher. That is a rise of 1.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Jess and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Mint and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. I'm looking at the Map Go function. I don't see a whole lot of boats in the Red Sea, but I see a bunch of them booking around
Such
Africa.
a great
Holy
function.
cow, man.
Looking at this Map
I mean, the
Go.
traffic going around the southern tip of Africa is just ridiculous, and that can't be good for shippers because I'm guessing that's going to add a little bit to the shipping and to the cost and all that. So let's break it all down, see what's going on out there in the world of global shipping. John Cartonis joins us. He's a managing partner, Breakwave Advisors. He's been covering this global shipping business for a long time, former senior analyst at Citi, doing the transportation thing, so he's certainly aware of his work from there. John, thanks so much for joining us via Zoom here. If I'm a shipper, am I going anywhere near the Red Sea these days?
Oh, good morning, and thanks for having me. Well, to just comment on your what you said before, actually, that's pretty good for shippers. Maybe it's not good for the consumer per se, but I mean, shippers are making more money for sure.
Yep.
Yes, you're not going anywhere close to the Red Sea, probably waiting to see how the situation is going to evolve. But as we have seen in the last month, most of the major mainly container ship companies are avoiding the Red Sea, and they're going around Africa, and they're asking for more money in order to do that. So for shippers, you know, it's good business. For the consumer, maybe not that great, and we'll see how this is going to end up in consumer price eventually. But that's where we are today.
Talk to us about the shippers specifically and who you think benefits most from this.
So it's not as straightforward as it seems. First of all, in order to go around Africa, you have to consume more fuel. So the consumer is going to pay for that, and that reflects on the shipping rate initially. Then they're asking for a lot of different surcharges, like war insurance and peak season premiums, stuff like that. So the increase you've seen in shipping rates is not really going all the way to the bottom line for these companies. But some will definitely drop to the bottom line if the situation persists. We've been in this situation for like a month and a half maybe, so not long enough to see a tightness in the market yet. But if this thing continues for the next several months, then what happens is that it will be a mini COVID-19 situation in shipping where you have this tightness in the supply chain. You don't have enough boxes where they should be, and these are the big container boxes to put consumer goods inside and ship them around the world. And so you might see higher rates, and these are going to be beneficial for the shipping companies and not as beneficial for the consumer.
So, John, the U.S. Navy and some of its partners are in the region supposedly to try to secure the shipping lanes. Is that even possible? Because it seems like the shipping companies aren't buying it yet, and they're still avoiding the area.
So a lot of things are happening on a minute-by-minute basis. Like, for example, today there was some news reports that the major shipping companies have an agreement with the Houthis in order not to attack their ships. This was denied by the major shipping companies. Then you had some news that the Houthis are not willing to attack any ships that are not calling on Israel or not related to Israel. And so all these things are just, whether our news or rumors are affecting basically markets and pricing. Now, whether it's possible for the U.S. Navy or the coalition, let's say, to protect shipping lanes is not as easy as it sounds, right? You're talking about thousands of miles of sea, open waters, and you cannot protect every ship that tries to transit there. They're trying, and I think, actually, to be fair, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the frequency of attacks has declined considerably. I think most of the attacks that happened in the Red Sea was the first half of December. And since then, you still have some, but not to the same intensity or frequency that you had initially. Now, whether that's because of the military presence or because there is some type of de-escalation, let's call it, in the whole situation, who knows? But I think, if you see the markets today, they're trying to price some type of de-escalation. Again, maybe it's a head fake, who knows? But it seems that today people are more comfortable.
What are the potential risks, if at all, when it comes to global economic growth?
That's a great question. I mean, the whole region there is very important for shipping, especially for Europe. I think something like 45% of imports to Europe goes through the Suez Canal, which is basically the Red Sea. So if this situation escalates further and you have no traffic going through the Red Sea, no traffic going through the Suez Canal, the first thing that's going to be reflected on will be inflation, higher cost of goods. The second thing will be a disruption in the supply chain, similar to what we had in COVID. But again, all these things take time. This is not like a 1-month situation. It will take months and months for this to happen. And I think it's not so much the pricing, but also making sure that you have the right assets at the right place. So if you don't have enough empty containers in China to move the goods, then you have delays in supply parts, let's say car parts or technology, things like that. So, but again, we're at the very early stages of that, and the headlines matter. Maybe there is some kind of an agreement indeed in place, and we see a de-escalation in the next few weeks. For now, the facts say that nothing has changed other than just these news reports.
Hey, John, who decides at the end of the day whether a ship will transit through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal? If I'm the captain, is it my call? Is it my company's call? Is it the insurance company? Who gets to make that call typically?
So the company makes that call, whoever operates the ship. Now, if the whole area was designated as a war zone, maybe it's the owner of the ship and the insurance that's going to say whether you're going to go through the area or not. But so far, the area has not been designated as a war zone. You have this channel, this protected, call it, area where you can transit, and you're allowed to go. And obviously, if you don't want to put at risk your ship, your asset, and of course, the lives of the seamen, you can avoid that. So container ship companies have been the first ones to do that. For other type of ships, like the oil tankers, or that move obviously oil, or the dry bulk ships that move coal and grains and iron ore, the impact has been less profound. I mean, you still have the ships transiting the Straits and the Suez Canal, but the container ship companies that has been the main target for in the last few weeks are not doing that, and they're just going around the Cape of Good Hope.
We only have about 30 seconds left, but when you were talking about the consumer, what particular industries within consumers do you think would be most affected from this?
So if you see what type of goods are moved in container ship boxes are basically furniture, clothes, some type of electronics, car parts, mechanical parts. So I think it's basically, the economy, the consumer. Is not so much bulk goods, as I said, because these ships, these goods are moved into dry bulk shipping, not in container ship boxes. And it's also initially probably that's going to be a European issue, but obviously we know that inflation jumps from area to area, so it's not going to be isolated in Europe.
All right. Hey, John, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate getting the benefit of your expertise there. John Kartsonis, he's a managing partner. Break Wave Advisors is the firm. Talking about global shipping. Again, check out Map Go on the Bloomberg terminal. Good stuff there. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Hey there, Paul. Elon Musk in the spotlight for his illegal drug use. Now, that includes LSD, cocaine, ecstasy, and psychedelic mushrooms. The Wall Street Journal says the news has Tesla's board worried. Now, Musk responded to that report. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow.
He said basically two things. The first, that after that infamous moment where he smoked marijuana in a Joe Rogan podcast, Elon Musk agreed at NASA's request to do random drug testing over a period of 3 years. And so by extension, if the allegations in the Journal story were true, then that drug use would show up in those drugs tests.
Tesla is up about 0.2%. Netflix was busy cutting back on original programming last year. Bloomberg's Steve Potisk has that story.
It was the first time it reduced the number of original shows in its pipeline, as it released about 130 fewer in 2023 than the year before. According to What's on Netflix, that's a dip of 16%. Output fell in every quarter last year in every major programming category. In the final 3 months of 2023, Netflix had its lightest slate of new releases in 5 years.
Netflix is up 1%. And after disappointing news for Apple over the past few days, shares finally higher. They're up right now, about 1.5%. Now, the company announced that its Vision Pro headset will go on sale February 2nd. The nearly $3,500 mixed reality headset will be available for pre-order on January 19th. Now, this is Apple's first major new product launch since the company introduced the smartwatch, and that was about 9 years ago. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. Stick around. We have more Bloomberg Markets in just a bit. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets here, we've kind of got some red and green. We've got the S&P 500 up about almost 0.6%. The Dow's off 0.2%. And NASDAQ's up 1.2%. Yields coming in here today. The 10-year Treasury's up 18.30, pushing the yield down about 7 basis points, 3.97%. WTI crude oil off 4.5%, $70.47 right now. So that's a risk-off trade there. Gold up, actually off just a little bit here, 20.33 an ounce. And Bitcoin up 1.6%, just under 45,000 right there at that mark here. So we're waiting for some SEC approval of some of these Bitcoin ETFs. So we'll see that presumably any day now. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get rolled in national news with
All right, thank you, Paul. Boeing has issued a detailed bulletin to operators of its 737 MAX 9 jetliners, the first step toward returning the partially grounded fleet to service. A fuselage section on a brand new Alaska Airlines jet blew out during a flight on Friday. Sheer luck prevented a more disastrous outcome. We get more with Bloomberg News Aviation's our Anthony Palazzo.
The investigators have found the door panel that fell out of the plane. This is a key piece of evidence. And they're going to be looking very closely at the condition of that panel to understand why it popped out. The panel was found in the backyard of a Portland area school teacher.
Bloomberg News Aviation's our Anthony Palazzo. Regulators grounded the entire fleet of 737 MAX 9s in the U.S. Black Monday has started in the NFL. The Washington Commanders firing head coach Ron Rivera. The Commanders finished the season at 4-13, and after 3 straight 7-10 seasons, Arthur Smith was fired last night as head coach of the Falcons. Parts of the Northeast still digging out from the first major winter storm of the season, but there are more weather systems on the move. More on this now. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
High winds are likely from eastern New Mexico across portions of Texas, the Gulf Coast, and into the southeastern United States. In fact, there could be some severe thunderstorms later today along the Gulf Coast, and there is the potential for some tornadoes from the Gulf Coast into the Carolinas over the next 2 days.
Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says in the Northeast, those hit by the heavy snow over the weekend could also see heavy rain Tuesday night into Wednesday. That increases your risk of flooding. Oppenheimer, Succession, and The Bear taking several of the biggest categories at the Golden Globes last night, and then there was an upset. Poor Things beat out Barbie to win Best Comedy. Barbie did take home Best Song. This is it. And new honor Best Cinematic and Box Office Achievement. Take that home as well. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Jess.
Thank you, Amy. We appreciate it. Jess Minton, Paul Sweeney here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Wanted to give a shout out to one of our star reporters, as you know, Paul, on our U.S. equities team, Elena Popina, who wrote today's Taking Stock column on how sleepy smart beta offers calm in a choppy market. So what she was writing about, one of the worst trades, rather, of the fierce rally that we did see last year was getting a moment of reprieve as we came into 2024. So that is actually low volatility. So a smart beta group that often trails the broader market on the way up, but falls less when things go sour. So she was looking at how, as major equity gauges fell last week, the Invesco S&P 500 low volatility ETF beat the S&P 500 by the most in 13 months, and its high beta peers by the most since the aftermath of a banking rout that we did see. So that really illustrates some of the nascent rotation undergoing beneath the surface of the S&P 500 as it is trading very close to a record. I was looking actually where that record was last reached on a closing basis from 2 years ago, roughly. It's actually around 1.5% away from that right now when you look at the S&P 500, Paul. So keeping a close eye on that.
Very good. Let me bring some. Thank you very much. Let me bring some breaking news on the sports front, the golf front. Tiger Woods thanks Nike's Phil Knight and staff in a post on X saying there will certainly be another chapter. So Sports Business Radio reported that Woods was considering parting ways with Nike to join On Running in a deal that would see the golfer take an equity stake in the company. That was on January 7th, Sports Business Radio reporting that. So Tiger Woods out with a tweet on X saying, I guess my time with Nike is over. 27 years. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
That blue button again. Coming up in this hour, we're going to talk to Michael McKee because we got some inflation data coming up to later this week. So we'll get Michael McKee's take on that. And then our C-suite conversation, Roland Herrings, CEO of Arbitrage, GAG, is going to talk to us about his company, the copper business, copper production, and the outlook for commodities in 2024. So he'll be joining us in studio, which is cool. And then Rania Sedham, managing partner at Sedham Law Group, will join to discuss the Anti-Deficiency Act as it relates to funding the government and legal liability for the weight loss drug developing companies. So there's a lot to go on the legal front there. Right now, let's kick things off with one from Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. Do you want to begin with commodities? Keeping an eye on crude oil right now. West Texas Intermediate crude is plunging by 4.7%. Spot gold down 0.6%. And Bitcoin up now by 1.6%. Bitcoin right around that 45,000 threshold. Bitcoin now at 44,972. The Dow lower, S&P 500 index and NASDAQ both higher. A rally in big tech sent stocks higher at the start of a week that will bring key inflation data and bank earnings. Those banks report Friday. CPI report comes out on Thursday. So here's where we stand midday. S&P up 29, gain of 0.6%. Dow Industrials down 57, a decline there of 0.1%, while NASDAQ is up 188 points, higher now by 1.3%. 10-year 3.97% with a 2-year at 4.30%. As for the market outlook, Evan Devitt is Chief Investment Officer at Moneta Investment Advisors, and she was a guest this morning right here on Bloomberg Markets.
I am a little concerned about the lack of breadth in the market, and we have never had a very focused portfolio on certain sectors. We've always had breadth that hasn't been rewarded. We believe it will be rewarded in 24.
And you can hear more of the conversation with Ethan Devitt on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Johnson & Johnson is paying $2 billion in cash to acquire Ambrx Biopharma, gaining a developer of widely sought drugs that target tumors with lethal drugs. And Boston Scientific has agreed to pay $71 a share in cash for medical technology firm Axonics, a maker of devices to treat urinary and bowel dysfunction. Again, recapping, U.S. stocks are mixed on this Monday. The Dow lower by 36 points now, a drop there of 0.1%. We've got Boeing weighing on the Dow down by 6.3%. S&P up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Metten, Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Here's Charlie was just reporting a little red, a little green on the screen. Let's get under the hood and see where some of the action is. Emily Graffeo joins us. She covers all the markets for Bloomberg News. Emily, what are you looking at?
Hello. Well, I'm looking at a number of retailers within the consumer discretionary sector because that's one of the best performing sectors in the S&P 500 today. Specifically looking at Crocs, ticker CROX. You guys know the shoes.
Yes.
The fashion community
Does
is
anybody
very
own the shoe?
divided. I don't.
You know, they unveiled what looked like a Western boot recently. We were talking about it with Carol Masser and Romaine. It was a couple of months back, but they were asking me if I wanted to wear it or not, given that I'm from Texas. But I don't have a yard to garden in, so I don't have a need for Crocs at this point in my life.
People have really strong opinions with Crocs. Like they either love them or they hate them. But at least today, the stock is up 21%, biggest gain since April 2020. They boosted their revenue forecast for the full year, which topped the average analyst estimate, now seeing revenue at $3.95 billion, which was higher than estimates. It's still down on a 12-month basis, though, down about 6%. But keeping an eye on Crocs. I mean, we'll see. Maybe 2024 is the year that
Year of the Crocs.
people are going to start wearing
Do you wear the
Crocs.
Crocs, Paul?
No.
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 I'm also
You don't like the rock those in your BMW?
So I could, but I'm not.
I feel, yeah, I know. When I was a kid at the beach, I feel like camp counselors were always encouraging me to wear the Crocs. I was like, not really for me. But taking a look at some of the other retailers as well, Abercrombie and Fitch, ticker ANF, that's up as much as 9.4%. They also raised their sales outlook in their fourth quarter outlook. They said better than expected holiday sales will help them reach their 2025 financial targets. This is another company that's had a really big resurgence in the last few years. Just like Crocs, Abercrombie was a brand that was very popular in the early 2000s. They recently have a new CEO over the last few years, and they've really turned that strategy around.
What a tear that stock was on last year.
Yeah.
When you thought it would be, when you're thinking of some of the biggest gainers, obviously NVIDIA and other stocks would come to mind, but Abercrombie last year up around like 300%.
And why? And why is
that? Is wild.
Well, Emily was just talking about some of the structural changes they've had, especially with their executives. So some of those stocks, especially those retailers that were really hot in like the turn of the millennium, are starting to come back
I actually
again.
am realizing right now, this is a disclaimer, my shirt is from Abercrombie.
Okay,
there we go.
Yeah, no, they have a lot of good products.
Well, I'm looking at look at this Wall Street. 3 buys, 6 holds.
A&R function?
Sells. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for Abercrombie and Fitch, so the Street's missing it here.
Yeah.
Out of the Street. Okay.
We have another retailer as well on the move, Lululemon, because that company also raised their outlook for the year ahead, but we're actually seeing that stock down about 0.5%. Some were saying that their net revenue estimates, people were expecting them to increase them even more, so perhaps that's why we're seeing some share weakness. Right. And I was taking a look at the Bloomberg article about Lulu's earnings, and it was interesting because it was written that shoppers were using buy now, pay later, and that boosted Lululemon, but it's interesting what that says about the consumer. If more people are using this, almost credit program where they're not paying up front.
Have you used buy now, pay later on any?
No, I haven't.
Not either.
Me neither. So
yeah. But
all right, it sounds like
maybe that signals some economic.
Sounds like the old layaway plan from back in the day.
Yeah.
But you don't get the item
right
that first day.
But yeah, if you look at that revenue outlook lagging behind the average analyst estimate at the midpoint of the forecast range, so that unfortunately what happened to that stock, even though it raised that guidance for sales, especially in that holiday quarter that we all know is important.
Yep. Ticker Lulu.
All right, there it is. I mean, it's a good one. Looking at the stock here, off just about a fraction here, but up 48% over the prior 12 months. So another retailer apparel retailer that's doing pretty well. All right, very good. Emily Graffeo, thank you so much for joining us. Emily covers all the markets for us. Coming up this week, if you go EcoGo, shows you all kind of the economic data that's going to be released going forward. You can do that for any part of the world. Mine defaults to the United States, thankfully. But we got some CPI data. We got some PPI data. This is inflation data for us lay people. Michael McKee, he parses through this data and he tells us what we need to focus on. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio.
That's right. Who better to talk to about all things eco?
So, Michael, what do you think the Fed's looking for? What do you think the market's looking for when we start getting some of this inflation data this week?
Well, everybody's looking for inflation to go down.
Yeah, go down.
This is going to be an interesting one on CPI Thursday because the headline number is forecast to rise a little bit.
Yep.
That's base effects, a very low inflation number in December of last year. Well, I guess it is December of last year, but December of 2022. And so it will affect what we see in the headline for this December. But the core rate's expected to continue falling. The kind of question is, last week in Europe, the ECB saw inflation do exactly the same thing, where the core went down and the headline went up, but the markets got all nervous. And it took them a while to back off of that. So do the markets here take that as a lesson and accept the numbers in stride, or do they also start to get worried about what might be going on?
I wanted to pick your brain over the comments from Lori Logan over the weekend. So of the Dallas Fed, she used to work at the New York Fed on the market side, but it was interesting in some of her comments where she started talking about how individual banks could start to see some liquidity constraints. And she was echoing some of when it came to what we were talking about with the balance sheet that were in the minutes that came from that December meeting last week. But what was your sort of takeaway from that? Because I thought it was interesting when she was kind of pinpointing some individual banks potentially and maybe some liquidity concerns there.
Well, we're starting to get to the point where the Fed is going to have to be thinking about this. They got the briefing from the staff at the last meeting. They'll probably talk about it at the next meeting. We'll hear more. Their plan has always been to reduce the balance sheet to what they call ample reserves, which right now we're sort of at superabundant or have been at superabundant. They can't define that. What they need to figure out is what's the minimum level of reserves that banks demand, and then put a pad on top of that to make sure that they have enough. So basically, they're sort of just like parking the boat or parallel parking in New York, where you sort of bump into the curb or bump into the car behind you, or very gently. That's what they'd like to do. So she's forecasting that we might see something like we saw in 2019, where there's a liquidity shortage, especially if they start to get to this point at a time of constrained liquidity like month end or year end. She's not predicting that we're going to have problems. And while we had a day or two of outsized rate increases for short-term paper the last time, it didn't cause a systemic meltdown. And so I think they figure they can ID when they need to start acting, and then it'll follow from that.
Well, we've talked so much about especially how markets are trying to price in when the potential rate cuts could be coming, but what about the balance sheet and the discussions when it comes to when to draw down and start discussing that when it comes to those Fed discussions? Because we got some indications from the minutes with that so far.
Yeah, well, what they did the last time and what they'd like to do this time is phase out rather than just stop completely, because they figured that would be more disruptive to the markets than what they like to call regular and predictable actions from the Fed. So if they set a taper schedule, then the market will know what's coming. The timing is hard to know exactly because they don't know exactly where they're going to stop, but Lori Logan's suggesting that it's almost time is probably a good hint, because she was, as you mentioned, the head of the System Open Market Desk at the New York Fed. I would guess somewhere in the end of the first quarter or beginning of second quarter. This may slightly depend on what they decide to do about interest rates, because if you're cutting interest rates but you're still doing QT at the regular level, you're working against yourself.
So I type in Fed Go, because that's probably about the extent of my knowledge of the Federal Reserve. But I do see that the next FOMC decision is January 31st.
That's right.
At 2 p.m. Could they just stand pat, or do you think the market really needs to see them at least do 25 basis points?
No, they're going to stand pat.
They're going to stand pat here.
They're going to make the argument that we haven't got enough information yet. They want to make sure that inflation continues to go down. The next meeting after that is March 20th.
Because we won't have the quarterly economic projections
Right.
at this next meeting. It won't be till the March one with the dots and that people focus
Right,
on heavily.
and so they would have 3 more CPI reports by March 20th and 2 more PCE reports, plus a couple of jobs numbers. So we are, after Thursday, we're through with the data that will matter to the Fed for January 31st. Okay. So they're going to argue that it's not enough.
I know the Atlanta Fed's reading when it comes to its GDP model can be volatile, as we've talked about in the past, but it looks like that latest growth around 2.5% for the fourth quarter. Obviously, a deceleration with that forecast from when we saw close to 5% growth in the third quarter, but still, that's definitely not a recession territory and still seems like a strong. How do you kind of view where the outlook could be for the fourth quarter when it comes to gross domestic product?
Well, it's a little hard to know. The reason the Atlanta Fed is volatile, and so are the other nowcasts that we get from various places, including Bloomberg Economics, is because they're based on the data that we have to date. And right now, we are working on getting December data, which we're just starting to get now. And so you don't have that final month of the quarter to tell you what growth is going to be like. We haven't got retail sales. We'll get that next week or week after next, I guess. And it's going to be, that'll be a key number. and then the PCE numbers will be key. But overall, it looks like growth has hung in there about as people expected. It's a little bit above trend. Trend is 1.8 to 2%. So if we're 2.5 as of today, according to the Atlanta Fed, that would be okay. You can't take it seriously as a promise this is where we are. It's just up to this date, this is what it would be like if we use these numbers.
So if we did use these numbers, wouldn't that be kind of soft landing-ish? Or maybe even better? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what the Fed is looking for, is a slowing of the economy, but not a collapse. And that's what Lori Logan described it. She said that the economy is settling down, but it is not collapsing. They want essentially trend growth or a little bit above. They don't want it below that. And right now it looks like that's what we have. We'll see if people keep spending. January is always an interesting month because you went out and bought all your holiday gifts.
Right.
And then are you still, spending? We get gift cards come into the whole retail sales equation in January. Because
that's a good point.
Because you got to go out and spend them.
Yeah.
So all that money that everybody who got a gift card, you still don't count in the economic data unless you were very quick. And so we'll see how the first quarter starts to develop as well.
What's the most important data point in your mind ahead of the next Fed decision on January 31st?
Well, CPI on Thursday is going to be the most important. If there was they could do something if there was something truly weird about it. But economists are pretty good at forecasting CPI. It doesn't usually surprise in any way more than, even if it's off by 0.1%, it's usually a rounding measure if you look at the 3-digit CPI numbers. So I think that we aren't going to see anything really surprising in the data. Probably the most interesting thing will be to listen to Fed officials who are speaking. John Williams, the New York Fed, he's the vice chair of the Open Market Committee and has a permanent vote, and we'll see what he thinks of the economy on Wednesday when he gives a speech. And that's kind of where we are at this point. Williams speaks before CPI, unfortunately. But if something weird happens, we still have a couple of weeks before the blackout period, so the Fed can let us know they're changing their mind if they are.
Boy, these guys speak a lot. It just seems like more so than back in the day, but maybe it's just me being
They
in the
might
business
say that
now.
about you.
They might say that about me. Where did the Sweeney
This
guy come
guy's
from?
on the air for hours every day.
Exactly. Get another job. Michael McKee, International Economics and Policy Correspondent for Bloomberg News, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Kind of get a little preview of some inflation data coming later this week. CPI,
That's right.
0.2% is the forecast. That would be a little higher than last period, 0.1%, but still pretty tame. And you take out the food and energy, the core, I guess, 0.3% is the expectation. That's right in line with last month. So, again, we'll get that, and then PPI as well on Friday. So lots of economic data for this market to discount it for this Federal Reserve to take a look at. S&P 500, it's up about 0.6%. This is Bloomberg. Let's go to Lisa Mateo right now for some company news.
News for Bayer's menopause drug. Of 2 final stage studies, it shows that the treatment helped reduce hot flashes in a trial of postmenopausal women. Bayer in Germany right now is down to 0.2%. Shares of Harpoon Therapeutics, well, they're up 112%. And this is after word that Merck is in talks to buy the cancer drug maker for about $700 million. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Joe Easton.
This company, Harpoon, they make a drug that basically uses somebody's immune system to help fight away cancers and break down tumours and things like lung cancer. And it's an area that Merck's looking to get into. They're already big on cancer, of course. They've got a massive market cap themselves, so they're worth around $300 billion. It's only a $700 million deal, so it's not huge for them.
Merck is down about 0.4%. A biotech giant grew its vaccine share, but it's not all good news. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti explains.
Moderna managed a bigger U.S. market share for COVID shots last year, even though the biotech giant reiterated a downbeat outlook for the year ahead. Moderna's business has faced rising pressure as the world learns to live with COVID and vaccine demand diminishes. The company said it still expects revenue to fall sharply this year.
Moderna is up nearly 2.5%. And some merger news. Boston Scientific set to buy medical technology company Axonics in a deal valued at $3.7 billion. Boston Scientific right now unchanged, but Axonics is up 19% right now. And Johnson & Johnson will pay $2 billion in cash to acquire Ambrx Biopharma. Ambrx develops drugs to target multiple cancers. Those are the company stories we're following this hour.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow lower now by 72 points, drop there of 0.2%. S&P up 28, higher by 0.6%, while NASDAQ is surging 190 points, a gain right now of 1.3%. NASDAQ 100 index doing a tad better, up 1.35% right now. We've got the NASDAQ 100 up by 220 points. 10-year yield 3.97% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.32%. Crude oil is now lower by 0.8, by 4.5%. WTI down 4.5%, 70.49 a barrel. Spot gold lower now by 0.8%, 2,029 on gold. Also, we are keeping an eye on Bitcoin today. Bitcoin now up by 2.2%, back above 40,000, back above 45,000, 45,225 on Bitcoin. NVIDIA, whose chip technology dominates data centers that are used to create artificial intelligence software, has announced new products to help the PC industry lure computers with AI PCs. Again, recapping, we do have stocks right now trading mixed. S&P 500 index is advancing up 26, a gain there of 0.4%. The Dow lower by 0.2%. NASDAQ up 1.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. C-suite conversation of the day. We're going to talk copper. You got to smelt this thing. I'm not sure what smelting is. You put metal, I don't know.
Dr. Copper, though, you know
Dr.
what it
Copper.
means for the global economy, economic growth, so
exactly
critical.
right.
All the components it goes to, especially companies in S&P 500 industries that use those chip makers, another big one, too.
So you got to talk about it.
Yeah.
And we got the perfect guest here. Roland Herring joins us. He's the CEO of Arubis GAG. It is a German company, Hamburg, Germany. There's some ADRs here in the U.S., AIAGY for the U.S. ADRs. Got a market cap about 3.6 billion U.S. dollars. Roland, thanks so much for joining us here in our studio. Talk to us about the global copper business. How's it going? How's business? How's the market? What's happening in your world of global copper?
Yeah, so copper is the metal of the future. It has been the metal of the past, but it's also the metal of the future. If you see the demand for copper is just has one direction, it's going up, because everything which is decarbonization, which is electrification in the end, means it needs more copper for handling electricity. So we see in e-mobility 3 times more copper in a car than in a conventional car. You see digital, you see renewable energies, and so on. So copper is really the perfect metal for the renewable energy sector. And we as Arubis, we are the largest producer of copper in Europe. We produce about 1.1 million tons of copper cathodes. And the major product that we supply is starter stock for the cable industry.
Okay.
And cables are everywhere. What works today without electric cables and electric supply, if it's digitalization or even energy supply? So we have a very positive business environment already today, and I'm very bullish about the future, combined also with the circular economy, the recycling part, where we're also leading with our technology. So all good for Arubis.
Well, thinking about the mining industry particularly, because they have highlighted how vulnerable some of the supply can potentially be, some of that related to some geopolitical issues, also different public protests that forced one of the biggest copper mines to actually close briefly in the last month or two because of that. But how does that, do you think, does that impact the outlook for what that means for the demand globally for copper? Or is that something that's more idiosyncratic?
There is a lot of copper, and the advantage of copper is there are many, many different mines. So even if the big one, if you take this case in Panama, we probably refer to, even this mine has just a small percentage of the global supply. So there's not the dependency of the industry and of Arubis from one single mine, which means we are diversified, also for technical reasons, and hence we have alternatives really easy to switch on, and we can compensate for any shortfalls. And it's quite typical, if you look in the copper industry, that there are some issues with mines. That's like in large industrial installation, you always have challenges. So therefore, in the projections for the supply and demand for copper concentrates to the smelter industry, there is always a certain disclaimer of mines which have some disruption, some technical problems, some whatever problems. And if this is factored in, you see that the copper concentrate market is balanced. That means what the smelters need is being supplied by the mining industry. So we have enough supply and good quality supply for the way forward.
Talk to us about you're based in Hamburg, Germany. Most of your business, it's a global business, but talk to us about the investment you're making, have made, continue to make here in the U.S. and Georgia.
Yeah, so the investment in Georgia is a big step for us to bring this technology of a large recycling plant of multi-metal recycling materials into the US market. We're doing this in Europe, and the investment in Georgia is part of our $1.7 billion investment package. And in Georgia alone, we are investing about 750 million euros. We are investing in strengthening our core business, which is multi-metal production, recycling and producing multi-metals, all the industrial metals and precious metals, and also growing. The second pillar is growing in recycling, where this investment in US is the big part of. And the third thing is sustainability and decarbonization. So investing in renewable energy, investing in solar-powered energy, electricity generation, and also improving our environmental footprint even further. So these are the 3 pillars, and US is a very important part of our investment package going forward. And it's the first step that we are going here to do in Augusta as we talk.
So many economists, as you know, came into last year so gloomy about the trajectory of where U.S. economic growth would be, as well as globally. But when you look at the direction of copper prices, what do you think this tells us about the global economy and how healthy it is right now?
Yeah. So if you think about, you mentioned this Dr. Copper, I think there is a lot of talk now, where is the copper price going to be? What we need as an industry and as an economy, we need more supply of copper. It has to come from recycling, where we have a major play, but also it has to come from additional mining activities around the world. There is enough copper in the world, and the question is, at which incentive level, at which pricing level, investors are going to spend money to build up quite high investment cases for new mining activities. So I don't predict any metal prices going forward. I can't just be wrong, but the demand is there, and the demand will grow in the coming years by millions of tons, which means there is a good incentive also for a good rationale for higher copper prices going forward.
What are the top 2 or 3 kind of customers you have for your company? Just give us a sense of who your customers are.
So the major customers that we have are the cable manufacturers. So we are converting the copper that we produce mainly into the starter stock for the cable industry, which is called wire rod. It's a standardized 8mm copper wire, and companies like the Prismians, like the Kofi Cups, like the Leonis, they are our major customers for these materials. And then they make all kind of cables for all kind of installations out of those.
What are you hearing from your customers right now as far as when it comes to demand?
It's really interesting. We see an increasing demand from our customers. So this electrification, this decarbonization drives our industry, our customers, and hence also us. And we have the first quarter. Our fiscal year starts in the 1st of October. So we have, from a demand point, a good quarter behind us. And we have some very good quarters ahead of us, given the contracts and the discussions that we have with customers. So our customers, our cable manufacturers, again, that's the major part, they are bullish about the demand going forward, and they secure capacities for the future.
Do you have business in China?
No.
No business in China?
No business in China.
Because that's atypical for a German company. I know one of the reasons people are concerned about the German economy overall is that they do a lot of business with China, and the growth just isn't there. What are some of the other areas of the world that you're investing capital right now?
So we are investing in Europe, which is our home turf, as we have started there 156 years ago, our business in Hamburg. So we are investing massively in Europe, which is the major part of our 1.7, and then US. These are the two focus markets, the two focus regions we are investing now. But we are not excluding it.
Why is that for Europe and the US versus not China?
Because we know, first of all, it's markets that we know where we have our base and where we can grow from. And we have very stable conditions and also positive outlooks in both regions. That's why we are focused. And you have to put it in perspective. Arubis is not a giant. It's not a big company. We have to put a focus. So to invest 1.7 billion in growth for our company is a big step. It's a big commitment, and we have to deliver. So we make this promise, and we're going to live on this promise. And then I don't exclude any other regions at the world at this point in time, but in the moment we have to focus on the US and on Europe.
Right, and does that also part of why China's been tightening its grip on copper? Is that part of the reason why it's just harder to try to invest, to your point, in that area?
For China, copper is also a very important metal. If you see, they rate copper as one of the indicators of progress. And they have invested strategically and driven by the government over many, many years now into the copper production. And China today represents 45% of the primary copper, of the smelting capacity in the world, and they continue to expand. Yet, given this high local capacity, China is still an importer of copper, of the metal, not just concentrate of the metal itself. So the economy in China is huge, and also with their major focus on renewable energies and also on electric vehicles, their demand is going to continue to rise, but they will continue also to invest in their industry. So that's where they stand.
Roland, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Roland Herring, CEO of Arubis, GAG. They are based in Hamburg, Germany, but he's in the States here seeing some investors, and I'm going to go down to Germany where they're investing a lot of money in a plant down there in, where's it in Germany?
In Hamburg.
Yeah, but where in Georgia? I'm sorry.
In Augusta.
Augusta. You know, there's a golf course there.
There's a golf course there.
There's a golf course there. All right, we appreciate looking at that right now. All right, we're going to be back in just a few moments. Right now, we're going to head down to Washington, D.C. We're going to go to World and National News, and we're going to do that with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul and Jess. President Biden is in Charleston, South Carolina today, speaking at a church where 9 black worshipers were gunned down by a white supremacist in 2015. Biden is addressing the rise in hate speech during his visit to Mother Emanuel AME Church. It's part of the president's effort to shore up support from black voters, who are seen as a crucial voting bloc for the upcoming election. Over the weekend, congressional negotiators announced they had agreed to top-line spending for the current fiscal year. That deal will help the government avoid a shutdown January 20th. The agreement, negotiated by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Mike Johnson, caps spending at $1.59 trillion. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons says Speaker Johnson came away with some victories.
pulling forward of $10 billion worth of funding cuts for the IRS, as well as the rescinding of $6 billion of COVID relief funding. So $16 billion in total cost savings that he can tout to his conservative colleagues. The question is really, is that enough for them? Indications are for at least some, like the House Freedom Caucus, no, they say this deal is worse than they thought.
Again, Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons reporting from Washington. The White House is weighing in on the emergency hospitalization of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. That was largely kept a secret. Two senior administration officials say the president is not considering firing Austin for failing to disclose that he spent time last week in the ICU following complications from a surgical procedure. Biden and his team are adamant Austin remains in good standing. Today is what's been traditionally called Black Monday in the NFL. The Washington Commanders have fired Coach Ron Rivera. Last night, the Atlanta Falcons fired Coach Arthur Smith, and the Panthers have fired GM Scott Fitterer more than a month after firing Coach Frank Reich. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Back to work Monday, first full trading week of the brand new year. We've got stocks mixed right now, but the S&P is at the best level of the day. We begin there up 32 points now, higher by 0.7%. The Dow in the red, lower by 46, down 0.1%. Boeing shares certainly weighing on the Dow. Boeing down 6.9%. NASDAQ now surging 210 points, up 1.5%. NASDAQ 100 index up 241, up 1.5%. And the Russell 2000 up now by 1%. 10-year yield 3.97% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.31%. Gold down $16 the ounce to 2,028, drop there of 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude now down 4.8%, 70.27 a barrel on WTI. Mixed market. As for the broader economic outlook, Joe Davis is chief economist at Vanguard, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
I am growing increasingly concerned about 2024, not from the growth perspective as much as if the Fed cuts rates aggressively, if we don't see labor market continuing to cool. So that's my biggest growing concern, particularly given recent Fed commentary.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Abercrombie & Fitch shares up 5.5%. Abercrombie raising its fourth quarter and full year sales outlook after better than expected holiday sales lifted the already outperforming retailer. And while we're talking retailing, Lululemon Athletica raising its guidance for sales and earnings after a strong holiday period for the activewear market. Right now, Lululemon up by 0.4%, up $1.81. Again, recapping, stocks mixed, but the S&P at the best level of the day, up 0.7%. The Dow down 0.1%. NASDAQ up 1.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pello, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Minton and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Jess, you got some news crossed in the terminal?
We do. French Prime Minister, when you are looking at this, Elizabeth Borne stepping down today. According to a statement from French President Emmanuel Macron's office, Borne and her ministers will continue to run the country until her replacement is named, according to the statement. So keeping an eye on this this afternoon, Paul.
All right, replacement has not yet been named, so we'll stay on top of that. All right, one of the big stories in not just healthcare, but you can argue the market overall last year was these weight loss drugs, Ozempic and the like here. You know, there's some legal stuff coming up here. Some of these things, their patents don't last very long, and there's some stuff going on out there. So we figured let's check in with Rania Sedholm, managing partner, Sedholm Law Group. Rania, talk to us about kind of what are some of the issues with these weight loss drugs in terms of, I don't know, patents and competition, similar drugs out there? What are you looking at?
Well, interestingly enough, Novo Nordisk's patent is set to expire in 2026, and companies don't want to wait until 2026, and apparently neither do consumers. And one company out of China, Huadong Medical, I apologize if I mispronounced that, sued in China and won and invalidated Novo Nordisk's patent. However, Novo Nordisk is upset about this and is currently appealing the decision. So stay tuned to determine when generics will be available to all.
Is there any sort of clear timetable of when that could be?
I couldn't give you a clear timetable even in the United States. The courts are clogged and busy and things take a lot of time. I have no idea, but I don't think a year is a long time. That much I can say.
Okay.
Yeah, a buddy of mine's actually talking about the courts being clogged. He's an attorney in New Jersey. Stuff that has been on his books for like 6-7 years is now just coming to trial because A, they're backed up from the pandemic, and B, there aren't any judges. Like judges have been retiring and leaving, and they haven't approved anyone to come in, so there's just no judges. I'm like, are you kidding me?
I've experienced that, and it's a terrible conversation to have with clients. It's extremely frustrating because we are in the business of providing solutions or trying to provide solutions, and there is none, and we just have to wait and see. Nobody likes to hear that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so on some of these weight loss drugs, I mean, these patents seem kind of short here, but I mean, I guess this is going to be a monstrous market. It is a big market.
It
and
is.
expected to explode here. So what are the Novo Nordisk of the world trying to do here? Because A, they're the ones that invested all this money to come up with these drugs. What are they doing to try to protect their position, I guess?
Well, obviously, they want you to wait until 2026 before the generics come out, but AstraZeneca and other big pharma don't want you to wait and are looking at oral medications, and apparently they're in like early stages, and we'll see when they are made available. But the most, interesting thing that's happening right now, at least in my opinion, are these compounding pharmacies. So compounding pharmacies are allowed to, by law, change formulas and create new drugs for specific patients or to assist with shortages. And we do have a shortage. Apparently it's global, but they're not using approved drugs. So the semaglutide, I think that's how it's pronounced, they're using a non-FDA approved version of it. And at least one state, the state of Virginia, is worried that there could be some health risks associated with the ingesting of it.
Is there I would think the answer is yes, but is there a black market for these weight loss drugs? Because the demand has got to be just crazy.
Oh, for sure. And some of them are on the internet. You can buy them from abroad. Of course, you're not quite sure what you're buying, but the bottle or the needle looks like it should.
I wanted to bring up a story that we had on the terminal from Bloomberg News reporters Simone Foxman and Laura Namias last week about how Ozempic's mania's billions in bills are coming for taxpayers. So they're writing about how state and local governments across the U.S. are grappling with this growing problem, about how, not surprisingly, expensive drugs to treat diabetes and obesity are threatening to drain their healthcare budgets. How do you view this? What's the issue here, and what could it mean moving forward?
Well, these drugs are very expensive. I know several people who are on it, and they're telling me they're spending, $1,200, $1,400 and plus per month.
Wow.
So that's a difficult number to sustain long term, and these drugs are supposed to be taken in perpetuity, so it's not even for a short period of time. So I think once drugs become generic and they're more widely available and the formulas change slightly, the costs come down because they're widely available in the marketplace. So I think we're going to be seeing a change in pricing, but not until more of these drugs are available.
Because right now, the question is, who does pay for it? I guess it's...
Yeah.
The point of, I guess, Simone's reporting is that it's coming back to the states, right?
Yeah, and it's draining their healthcare budgets, is what they were writing about.
Yeah, so on that side, you could say, boy, it would be good to get to generics as quickly as possible to lower the cost for people, because we know the demand is there,
That's true, but there is a lot of controversy. And again, I don't know what my opinion on this is. I haven't really thoroughly given it some thought, several people are taking the drug not because of diabetes. This is a diabetes treating drug.
Specifically for that.
Yes, and there are a lot of drugs, like metformin, for example. It's used to treat a variety of things. So if this drug was initially made to help with a variety of matters, or it's now been discovered that it helps with a variety of matters, then something needs to be done to assist with the shortage, if nothing else.
Yeah, I saw a story just early on this, the Ozempic thing. This is something on TV about this one doctor in Beverly Hills was writing a lot of prescriptions.
Oh my goodness!
Ozempic, and they were just looking at people walking in and out of his office, and they're all the beautiful people, but they were still getting all these scripts, and it didn't seem to be.
My goodness! And it's supposed to be for people who are diabetic.
Yeah, diabetic, obesity, and all these underlying health issues associated with that. So there's a lot to do from the government perspective, from the inflation, from the insurance perspective, and then also the legal side in terms of the patents and generics and compounding pharmacies, as you mentioned. So a lot to develop here for this market. So we'll stay on top of that, of course. Rania Sedholm joins us, and we appreciate getting her time, managing partner at Sedholm Law Group. So I don't know anybody who's taking these.
I personally do not either.
I do not. Maybe they do.
Maybe they haven't told me that. They don't want to tell me.
Maybe it's just something like that.
They're doing it under the radar.
All right, S&P 500, we're up about 0.7%. The Dow's off only about 0.1%, so pairing some of those losses. The NASDAQ is kind of where the action is, up 1.5%. 10-year Treasury yields down about 7 basis points, 3.97% on your 10-year. WTI crude oil, boy, almost 5% decline here, $70.30. So really seeing the risk premium come out of crude oil. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news with Lisa Mateo.
You got it. The first step toward returning a partially grounded fleet of 737 MAX 9 jets is underway. Boeing has issued a bulletin to the operators of the aircrafts outlining the inspections that are needed after that panel blew off during an Alaska Airlines flight. Bloomberg Intelligence airline analyst George Ferguson suspects that the structural issue is an isolated problem.
We're not finding plugs blowing out of other aircraft. We're not finding them blowing out of other Dash 9s. And so, to me, when I look at the piece that fell away, the cleanness of that of what fell away from the airplane, it looks to me like someone on a production line didn't install all of the fasteners that needed to be installed to keep that panel in place.
Now, Boeing is down about 6.5%. Shares of its supplier, Spirit Aerosystems, well, those are down about 6.5% as well. And the news also affecting the two carriers here in the U.S. that use those specific jets. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman has more on that.
United has about 79 MAX 9 jets, Alaska 65. And Monday flights are also being canceled after a weekend where there were 270 flights canceled for United, 163 for Alaska. That amounts to about 1/5 of Alaska's overall flights. Alaska saying these groundings could continue through at least midweek.
Now we have Alaska is up just about 0.1%. United Airlines up about 2.5%. And Astro Biotech Technology says its moon landing is in jeopardy. And this is after a propulsion problem or an engine problem prevented the spacecraft from pointing toward the sun for power. This is an AP report at launch this morning. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is...
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we got the Dow Jones Industrials, which had been down about 0.5% earlier today, just about flat, down about 8 points. The S&P is up about 0.8%. The Nasdaq up 1.5% there. 10-year Treasury yields 3.97% on your 10-year. And we'll just highlight WTI crude oil once again. That's off 4.6%, $70.30 for WTI crude. As some of the tensions come out of that part of the world a little bit, just from the Red Sea perspective. So we'll keep an eye on that. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Nancy Lyons has got world and national news for us.
Thanks, Paul. Hezbollah says a senior commander was killed in South Lebanon in the fight against Israel. AFP is reporting the commander was killed while in a car that was struck by Israel. It is raising concerns the war between Israel and Hamas will escalate into a wider Middle Eastern conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the region, hoping to calm tensions. The New York Times is reporting Israel has begun a new and less intense phase of its invasion of Gaza. The risk of a shutdown on January 20th has been eased somewhat with word of a deal on government spending caps. Bloomberg's Amy Morris has details from Washington.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Mike Johnson negotiated the bipartisan deal, which caps spending at $1.59 trillion. Republicans have agreed to a set of budget moves to spare immediate cuts to domestic agency budgets. The deal does not include an agreement to block all conservative policy writers, so there still may be debates over defunding investigations into former President Trump. And while that might cause an impasse later, for now, lawmakers have the framework they need to avoid a government shutdown this month. The next deadline is February 2nd. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
House Republicans are preparing to hold the president's son, Hunter Biden, in contempt of Congress for defying a subpoena to appear for a closed-door deposition. He did agree to a public hearing. The committees leading the impeachment inquiry into President Biden will vote on Wednesday to bring the contempt resolution for a full House vote. The chamber can then vote to refer the matter to the Justice Department, which will ultimately decide whether to pursue charges. House Republicans are also moving forward with impeachment proceedings against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. That's going to happen this week. The House Homeland Security Committee is expected to hold its first impeachment hearing against Mayorkas on Wednesday. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Paul and Jess.
All right, Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Big news in the world of sports marketing here. Golf legend Tiger Woods' nearly 3-decade partnership with Nike has come to an end, Woods said Monday. Here's a tweet he put out there. Over 27 years ago, I was fortunate to start a partnership with one of the most iconic brands in the world, Woods said in a statement posted on X, formerly Twitter. Phil Knight's passion and vision brought this Nike and Nike Golf partnership together. And I want to personally thank him along with the Nike employees and incredible athletes I have had the pleasure of working with along the way. Knight is Nike's founder and former chief executive officer. So that's been iconic, that partnership between Tiger and Nike.
And then you also think of the iconic red shirt that he'll wear on Sundays when he's playing during those tournaments, and then a Nike shirt. So, I mean, that's usually the first kind of visual that comes to mind, right?
Exactly, and that's famous. So Woods signed his most recent deal with Nike worth $200 million in 2013. As for what's next for Woods, he said, quote, people will ask if there's another chapter. Yes, there will certainly be another chapter. See you in L.A. The Genesis Invitational Tournament, which Woods hosts, starts February 15th near Los Angeles. Nike said in a statement via text message, throughout the course of our partnership, we have witnessed, along with the rest of the world, how Tiger not only redefined the sport of golf, but broke barriers for all of sport. We watched him set records, challenge conventional thinking, and inspire generations of people around the globe. We are grateful to have been part of it. We wish him the best in the future. So it seems like an amicable sport there.
So wonder who's next.
Yeah, I don't know who's next, but I'm sure there's some reporting out there that there is another brand that he'll probably have an equity opportunity there, so he could have another growth there for his wealth, which has just been extraordinary.
Monumental.
Yeah, exactly. So you think about two iconic brands, Tiger Woods and Nike,
That's right.
parting ways, but it was a heck of a partnership for 27 years. So interesting news there in the world of sport. Right now, we have, what do we got coming up? Sound On?
Sound On, Joe Matthew.
He's down in Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Only 1 week to Iowa. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as Republican candidates barnstorm the state ahead of the caucuses with just days to go now. We'll talk about the state of the race with former Republican presidential candidate, of course, former Congressman Will Hurd, also with insights today on a border deal here in Washington they say could emerge by the end of this week. They are making deals. Congressional leaders agree to top-line spending levels, even though they did that already. We'll talk shutdown politics ahead and all of our top stories with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are along for the hour. And we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. Let's get to it right now. Trading in New York with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. And a big, warm welcome back to Joe Matthew. Great having you here. We've got stocks trading mixed right now, but do want to begin with a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. In the pharmaceutical world, Novartis said to be in advanced talks to buy Cytokinetics. That headline right now on the Bloomberg Professional Service. We do have shares of both companies right now on the move. Cytokinetics surging 10.8%. As for Novartis, its ADRs now unchanged on the day. But again, the headline out of the Bloomberg, out of the Wall Street Journal on the Bloomberg, Novartis in advanced talks to buy Cytokinetics. Right now, stocks are trading mixed. Little change on the Dow, down 4 points, a drop there of less than 0.1%. We have got the S&P 500 index holding on to a 34-point gain, up 0.7%, while NASDAQ, the composite index, up 1.5%, higher now by 216 points. 10-year yield, 3.97%. We have got the 2-year that's yielding 4.32%. As for the market backdrop, Subhadra Rajappa is head of U.S. rate strategy at Societe Generale.
There's a lot of uncertainty on the policy front. There's also uncertainty on the geopolitical front. So I think investors are being a little bit cautious heading into the beginning of the year and where they want to deploy cash.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Boeing shares are slumping the most in more than a year after its 737 MAX 9 model was temporarily grounded by authorities following last Friday's accident involving a recently delivered airliner. Boeing shares are now down by 6.1%. Spiro Aerosystems Holdings, which makes the fuselage for the 737, is lower as well. That's stock down by 6.5%. And Alaska Air Group, the parent of the carrier involved, it is down by 0.2%. Right now, we have got spot gold down $17 the ounce to $2,027, a drop there of 0.8%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is now slumping 4.6%, $70.37 a barrel. Again, recapping a rally in big tech stocks, S&P trading higher by 0.7, NASDAQ now up by 1.5%, the Dow lower a little change, down 7 points. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I know I'm back when I see the patented double point from Charlie Pellet. You can find us on YouTube and know what I'm talking about. Join me in the studio here in Washington, Charlie, and the rest of the gang in New York by going to YouTube. Search Bloomberg Global News. This is hour one, and I did miss you, I have to say. Happy New Year, since we haven't had a chance to say that yet. I know it's getting a little late. Do you go through that at the store, at the gas station, now that we're a weekend? Do you still say Happy New Year? I'm still saying it. Happy 2024. It's going to start coming together now as Congress returns to town, and that's why we're spinning a couple of plates today. You've been hearing on Bloomberg about a deal on top-line spending levels that might help to avoid a government shutdown, they say. Aren't those the same levels we agreed to back in June? We'll get to that, along with talk of a border deal potentially by the end of this week. And I know you've heard me say that before. But it's 1 week from Iowa, and that's where I want to start the conversation with Will Hurd, of course, former Republican presidential candidate. He's now behind Nikki Haley in the campaign, longtime Texas congressman, former CIA officer, and can touch all of the stories that we're talking about here, from the campaign to the border to shutdown politics. Congressman, it's good to see you. Welcome back. Voters actually are going to start having a say. A week from today, we're going to have more than just polls to talk about. And I wonder if it's a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump wins the Iowa caucuses.
It's not a foregone conclusion. And Joe, I'm going to start with Happy New Year. I'm still saying it.
I appreciate that.
And look, here's what we're going to see. You're seeing a number of town halls that are being done by Fox News this week. Donald Trump is actually finally participating in one. You're going to have a debate later this week, which is ultimately going to see Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis go head to head. And then we have voting next Monday. People should also be paying attention to the weather. Because right now it's expected that weather in most parts of Iowa is going to be in the negative teens. That's going to impact the number of people that come out for caucuses. So it's not a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump wins. He thinks he's going to win by a large number. If he doesn't win by a big number, people are going to be talking about his vulnerability. So a lot can happen still in 7 days.
Well, you just made a great point. Aside from the weather, and we are bundling up for this, I'm actually a little bit scared. And that's a real deal. It's not just about those of us who are there from warmer climes that'll be shivering in Des Moines. That could actually be a turnout story, and you can speak to that. But the way you just framed it is basically a question of by how much will Donald Trump win? In other words, a potential moral victory for someone who could come in second place in a strong showing. Is Nikki Haley that candidate?
I think Nikki is absolutely that candidate. She's the only person that has been having momentum since the very beginning of this race. Actually, when you look at head-to-head comparisons in a general election between her and Joe Biden, she's winning by double digits. Most people only focusing on the fact that Donald Trump may be up on Joe Biden by 3 or 4 points. Nikki Haley has consistently been up by double digits. So if Republicans want to see a absolute victory in November, Nikki Haley is the best choice, and that helps up and down the ballot. And when we look at the debates that are going on in Congress, you want to make sure there's really big coattails to keep the House in Republicans' hands. Right now, we're basically at Republicans only have a 2-seat majority. That can potentially flip in November. Senate looks good for Republicans taking over. So if you want to see conservative leadership in Washington, D.C. and getting things done, I think Nikki has the best chance, and that's the case she's been making throughout these early states.
I'm going to throw this at you before I change the topic to what's happening here in Washington. Would love your take on that as we spend time with Will Hurd. The Emerson poll out of South Carolina out Friday shows a tough go for Nikki Haley in her home state. 25% to Donald Trump's 54%. There's been a lot of talk about some of the confusion surrounding her answer on what caused the Civil War recently. Is that going to be a deficit for her in South Carolina? And how important will that state be for her potential to move forward?
She's made it very clear that the Civil War, the reason for the Civil War was slavery. She has talked about her mistake and not having that be the first thing that came out of her mouth. I think many of her opponents are using that in order to try to create drama and to stop that momentum that she's been seeing. But I think you're going to start seeing momentum continue to build in Iowa and New Hampshire as she goes into her home state that she knows incredibly well. And so, this is, as you said at the top of this conversation, it's exciting that we're soon going to get to have to not worrying about what polls are saying and seeing what voters are actually saying. Because I will say this. If you look at some of the polling versus votes of significant votes over the last, let's call it 9 months, the abortion ballot initiative in Iowa, the gubernatorial race in Kentucky, the polling did not reflect what actually happened at the ballot box. And so this is going to come down to who has the best organized campaign and when voters were finally thinking about, what do we want? Do we want, 4 more years of chaos? Or do we want someone who's thoughtful, who understands foreign policy? Do we want an accountant in the White House so that we start actually getting our financial house in order?
Well, I'll tell you, the story here in Washington today is not so much about the presidential campaign, who the next president will be, but whether we're going to have a government shutdown in a couple of weeks. And I know that there's now an agreement on top line spending. It's the same agreement we had in the debt ceiling deal. So I have to admit, I don't know if there's even much reason to talk about it because it doesn't feel like progress. Jim Lankford, though, says there is progress on the border, Will Hurd. Last time you were here, there was a hope that this might be done by the end of the year. It, of course, would help to unlock funding for Ukraine, but would bring a long-sought compromise on border security and on immigration reform, on asylum law. Are you as optimistic now as you were a couple of weeks ago here? Because we're hearing from negotiators, including Lankford, that there could be text by the end of this week.
Look, Lankford is a serious guy. He's a thoughtful guy. He's not someone, he's not going to say that if they're not close to some kind of deal. But we have to look at all this stuff together. And I agree with you, the top line numbers is an agreement to agree to the last numbers. And that's going to require the House to then you got to actually write the bill that matches that number. And let's be frank, the conservatives in the House that are criticizing this again have never voted to fund the government. So the fact that there's going to be something that appeases them is just ridiculous. It's, can Speaker Johnson get half the Republicans to vote for it, and are Democrats willing to participate? But you got to be able to have a government open in order to get this side deal to deal with supplemental funding between Ukraine and the border. The border is continuing to be a crisis. I'm always going to be hopeful that something gets done because the communities along the border have been suffering for 5 years. We think about, most people only think, when New York and Chicago and LA started complaining, that's when it really became a crisis. No, it's been a crisis. It's been a crisis since the last year of Donald Trump's presidency. He's the one that began this problem, and then it just became considerably worse under President Biden. Last month, I think it was 320,000 people were apprehended. That's the all-time high in the history of our government. So this is a real crisis.
We're seeing some staggering figures, that's for sure. And I wonder if you think it's a good time then to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary. The first hearing will take place in the House on Wednesday. Alejandro Mayorkas, of course, is seated at the negotiating table, we're told at least, helping to represent the administration. Is this the moment to pull the plug on the secretary?
Look, if I was President Biden, and let me be frank, I'm not one to generally give him advice that's good for him. If I'm Joe Biden, I would fire Secretary Mayorkas. When you look at some of his bad polling numbers, especially in a general election against general election voters, a significant amount of the drag on Joe Biden is his bungling of the border crisis. And so this is, there's a lot of Democrats that are frustrated with Secretary Mayorkas. And just look at the record. This is the worst the border crisis has been in our country's history. We've had over 5 million people come into our country illegally under Secretary Mayorkas. The data shows he's done a terrible job. And I am of the opinion that they have not been actually implementing legislation appropriately. We've made it very clear what asylum is supposed to be. They're having an incredibly generous definition of asylum, which is allowing these millions of people to come into the country. And to me, that alone is a violation of Secretary Mayorkas' duties.
Well, it's looking like he may well lose his job. Will Hurd, while you're with us, I have to get your insights quickly on the Secretary of Defense. And I ask you this as a former CIA officer. I'm guessing this is not a major kitchen table story right now, but he kind of went missing, having gone into Walter Reed for an elective surgery before Christmas. He was readmitted on New Year's Day, experiencing severe pain, and he is still there now. Apparently, there was a breakdown in communication, Congressman. By that, I mean no one knew he was there. They had to call the deputy secretary on the beach on vacation in Puerto Rico. This is something clearly that could have been planned in advance. How important is this breach of protocol?
Well, I think it comes to a lack of trust. And if you can't handle something this significant properly, how are you going to handle something that's moving fast? You know, the fact that the deputy secretary had most of the authorities at that time because of some other agreement, but the fact that Secretary Austin had not notified the president and the folks within the department, it makes no sense. And that now we're days later, we still don't have the full story. This is a problem. I think everybody wishes him and hopes that he's healthy and safe and has a speedy recovery, but this is not how you handle the fact that one of the most important people in our government has to go into the hospital.
Will Hurd, it's good to see you, former congressman, former Republican presidential candidate, back with us on Bloomberg Radio. Come back and see us again soon. In fact, we'd love to talk once the voting does begin. I'd love to hear from the panel on this quickly. The matter of the Secretary of Defense. We're going to have a lot of time for the border and shutdown politics coming up. But let's bring in Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. It's great to see you guys. Happy New Year. I missed you both. Rick, there are some folks who, or at least on the Republican side, think the defense secretary should be fired. Should there be accountability here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, somebody needs to be fired. I mean, there's obviously a chain of command that exists, and
there we go.
And I think that if you know the secretary was incommunicado because of his health, it falls on others within the department to make sure that they're maintaining this level of transparency that's due a senior member of the cabinet like this. I mean, honestly, it's just outrageous. So, yeah, I think a head should roll.
A head should roll, Jeannie. The administration is speaking. John Kirby earlier today said Lloyd Austin stays in the job. Their concern right now is his health. Should we wait to learn more before we judge what happened?
Yeah, I think we should all be concerned about his health, that we all can be. But the reality is that this is about national security. And can you imagine the CEO of any company disappearing for a week? You know, there are 27,000 or more people who work at the Pentagon. And their argument is that the woman who was supposed to inform the president was out sick. Something is amiss here. It is a problem that he is in line for the presidency. He has the nuclear codes. The president needs to lead, and he needs to deal with this. Absolutely, the optics, the concern about his hospitalization and what's going on, we should all be concerned. But this is about national security while we're in an active war zone across the world. And so I do think the White House is going to have to address this.
I mean, at least I called somebody when I was out for a week, Jeannie. We'll have a lot more with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, as we pick their brains on a potential deal on the border and whether we're going to shut down. By the way, a week away from Iowa, a week from today, and Rick and Jeannie will be with us. We'll have more straight ahead on Sound On. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long. Here at Bloomberg, we have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average now trading a little changed. It is lower by 5 points. S&P 500 index holding on to a 35-point gain, up by about 0.8%, just about the best level of the day right now, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is advancing 1.5%. NASDAQ 100 Index also up by 1.5%. Bottom line here, we got a rally in big tech that is sending stocks higher at the start of a week that will bring key inflation data and bank earnings. We get the CPI report on Thursday, and then Friday, the likes of JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, all checking in on Friday. Crude oil, big story today. We have got West Texas Intermediate crude now slumping by just about 3.8%, 75.73 a barrel on WTI. And West Texas Intermediate crude, as I mentioned, down 4.7%. Brent is down 3.9%, 75.72 for a barrel of Brent. And to be clear, West Texas Intermediate, 70.35 a barrel. Gold down $18 the ounce, down by about 0.9%. 10-year yield, 3.98%. The 2-year, 4.32%. Apple's first major new product in 9 years will arrive on February 2nd, setting the stage for what the company hopes is a new era after the iPhone. The Apple Vision Pro is a $3,500 mixed reality headset. Apple shares up now by 1.6%. Again, recapping the Dow, little change, down now by 5 points. S&P up 35, a gain of 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Big screaming headline over the weekend. Reporters called into bureaus to write the story of the grand deal that was put together here in Washington, D.C. The House and Senate leaders, Speaker Johnson, Senator Chuck Schumer, and an agreement at last on top-line spending levels, something that we've apparently been waiting for, even though they're the same levels we got back in June. I'm having a little bit of trouble with this one. As we remember, the movie Gaslight from 1944 was once Angel Street on stage. Remember this? The husband trying to drive his wife insane. Things start to go missing. Gaslights dim without being touched. And as I read here on the terminal, $1.59 trillion, the new top line negotiated here in Washington, D.C., a cap on discretionary spending. Interesting. That's the same exact number that was in the debt ceiling deal back in June, the one that helped to get Kevin McCarthy fired. Yet here we are again talking about this as if it's news. It includes rescissions, and this is what the speaker says is new, of unused COVID funding and cuts to the IRS. They add up to about $16 billion, which is barely a rounding error. And so conservatives in the Freedom Caucus are not happy. And it's very difficult to tell whether we just improved our chances or not. This is happening at the same time as negotiating over the border takes place in Washington, as we reassemble the panel for their take. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are here, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, am I going crazy here? $1.59 trillion, it's the same number. We could have missed all that drama. If we just go back to June, we'd have the same deal we have now, right?
That's right. It's like deja vu all over again. And you mentioned gaslighting, and I was thinking of another film. But, you know, the reality is that this is pretty much all that Johnson could get. And the real question is where you ended. Is he going to be able to keep his job in the aftermath? It really almost doesn't matter what Chip Roy and the conservatives say on this. They're going to push him to the right as much as possible. But the reality is he's going to need Democrats to get this passed. And, you know, one question to keep in mind is, are they going to push him enough so that he tries to include things involving abortion or LGBTQ rights, which will really create an uproar and have him lose some needed Democrats? So that's what we're talking about here. Otherwise, this is pretty much what McCarthy negotiated and what eventually he reneged on and what got him fired.
Wow. Freedom Caucus calls it a total failure. Rick, I could go through all of the individuals here from Chip Roy to Andy Biggs, but I think you get the point. Is the speaker gaslighting us? How do we call this a new deal?
Yeah, it's a joke is what it is. I mean, his strategy has taken us full circle to exactly as you said, right back to the very beginning. It sounds like a bad Sound of Music episode. And so, like, the bottom line is that now they found a new problem. You know, the same guys, Gatz, Biggs, Rosendale, all these guys who, you know, threw out McCarthy as speaker over the budget deal have now said, now the budget deal is less problematic than the fact that we need to have HR2 embedded in the budget deal, the House's big border security plan. So you can keep the number, but you got to have border security in there too. And I just think they keep moving the goalposts. It doesn't help the speaker. I doubt if he's going to lose his job over this, but as Jeannie said, there's not going to get anything done unless they have Democratic votes. And if they have Democratic votes, none of these people's voices matter.
So not only has nothing changed since before the holidays, but not since last June, just a different guy holding the gavel here. The border, you mentioned, Rick, may well be intertwined here. In fact, they're talking about potentially moving all of this as one piece if a border deal can be reached in the Senate. Now, I realize the speaker's talking about negotiating directly with the White House now, because a Senate deal may not fly in the House. This is the latest, though, from James Lankford, the senator, the Republican senator at the negotiating table. He was on Fox News Sunday.
Text hopefully this week to be able to get that out. Everybody will have time to be able to read it and go through it. No one's going to be jammed in this process, but it's a matter of trying to be able to get this out. But to make law, we've got to have a Democrat Senate, a Democrat White House, and a Republican House to be able to go through this. So this agreement has to work. Everyone's counting on this actually working, but it's going to have to be agreement that a White House, that it's a Democrat White House and a Democrat Senate can also line up with a Republican House, and we're working to thread that needle for things that actually work.
All right, Jeannie, he says text could emerge by the end of this week. That would mean they're pretty darn close. It would also be a day or two after the first impeachment hearing for Alejandro Mayorkas. How's this all going to come together since he's involved in these negotiating sessions?
Yeah, that's right. And you asked Representative Hurt the right question about, is this really the time to impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security? Not to mention, you know, I'm trying to just figure that when Johnson goes over to the White House to negotiate with the president, this will be just before or after they vote on Mayorkas. They decide to hold his son in contempt. And, oh, by the way, they decide potentially on impeaching him, because those are the kind of things that the conservatives are going to push Johnson to do to save his job. You couple that with the calendar, the coming 24 election and the votes there, and the fact that Donald Trump has been out on the stump making big hay out of the issue of immigration. So I go back to the reality that I cannot see a world in which Republicans allow Joe Biden and the Democrats to get a deal on immigration. As much as Lankford is negotiating in good faith, I don't see how they allow this to happen. And 24 is going to be looming over all of this.
What do you think about that, Rick? Because we know the border is not playing well for Joe Biden now, and this new CBS News YouGov poll underscores that. 68% disapprove of the president's handling of the border. 63% think he should be tougher on the border. That's the backdrop for this conversation. Donald Trump and, well, I guess Mike Johnson both know that this would probably help Joe Biden if they got a deal.
Yeah, I think that the reality is Republicans have to, at some point, do something proactive on the border. They can't just throw up poison pill legislation that doesn't go anywhere. Republican constituents, voters care about this, and they both care about different things. I mean, we got to remember that voters for the Democrats, voters for Biden, they want a more efficient process. They want the border more secure, and Republicans want more border security and then a more efficient process. So they have a totally different point of view on what is success. Both are under some level of pressure to make progress. As you know, former Congressman Will Hurd said, you can't have a year where you have, you know, hundreds of thousands a month of hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants crossing the border and not take a hit if you're a Republican or a Democrat.
you think we're going to shut down? I'll ask you both. Rick, we're looking at two different dates. I'll remind everybody. One is late this month. The second is early February. There are only, 8 legislative days to figure this out? How's this going to happen?
Look, you've got a half a dozen approach bills. You ought to be able to get those done on the House side in the first series of administration budget deals. And on suspension, you could pass that with Democrats and Republicans together. No brainer. Now, as long as there are no poison pills in those bills. So right now, if the Republicans want to sabotage the system, they put poison pills in there and have to force the Democrats in the Senate to rewrite everything.
That is important, Jeannie. The Speaker could still go there if he wanted to. Do you think we're heading for a shutdown?
I hope not. I don't think so. It's not in anybody's interest to shut down. As Rick just mentioned, the poison pills are the big thing to watch, especially on abortion and LGBTQ rights. That would be devastating to the bill. And by the way, the calendar is tough, as you mentioned, 8 days to that first deadline. That's tough in normal circumstances.
But how about it? A little New Year's optimism from Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, both agreeing there will be no shutdown. And of course, we're going to be thinking about this conversation when we walk up to those dates, realizing it'll be kind of a partial shutdown and then a whole shutdown in February. And all this is going to coincide with what's happening in Iowa. Can you imagine? After Donald Trump spends this week in courtrooms across the country, actual voting, actual caucusing will take place next Monday. We're going to get into that next. And as well, what Joe Biden thinks about that with our panel. After we update world and national news, let's hear from Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Hezbollah says a senior commander in southern Lebanon was killed by Israel today. We got more from Bloomberg's Dana Kraish.
This is raising concerns in the region that the war in Gaza and what has been limited fighting between Hezbollah and Israel is actually escalating and could widen. This is the second killing of a Hezbollah commander in Lebanon within a week that Israel was blamed for. Of course, Israel was blamed for last week's killing of a top Hamas leader in Beirut.
Bloomberg's Dana Kraish reporting from Dubai. Donald Trump is asking a Georgia judge to toss out the state's criminal case accusing him of leading a conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election, arguing that he's immune from prosecution over his actions as president. In a filing today in Atlanta, Trump argued he was cleared of wrongdoing stemming from the 2020 election when the U.S. Senate acquitted him at his impeachment trial. President Biden is hoping today's trip to Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, will help boost his standing among black voters. That was the church where a white supremacist murdered 9 worshipers in 2015. Biden says MAGA Republicans led by Donald Trump are a threat and deny that January 6th was an attempt to overthrow the government.
An extreme movement in America, the MAGA Republicans, led by a defeated president, is trying to steal history now. They tried to steal an election. Now they're trying to steal history, telling us that violent mob was, and I quote, a peaceful protest.
Biden says Donald Trump has a dangerous agenda. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow lower now. S&P, NASDAQ, they are both gaining. A rally in big tech, sending stocks higher at the start of a week that will bring key inflation data and then bank earnings on Friday. S&P right now up 34. That is a gain of 0.7%. Dow Industrials down 26. Drop there of 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 index up 253 points, up 1.6%. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index up 1.6%. And the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares up now by 1.4%. 10-year yield at 3.99% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.34%. Spot gold down 0.9%, 20.27 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude now down 4.4%, 70.57 for a barrel of WTI. The cost of living will be the focus of this week's major U.S. economic data. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
We'll get December's Consumer Price Index on Thursday. Bloomberg Economics says bouncing gasoline prices could have an impact on the household data. Looking at 2024, Bloomberg Economics sees U.S. inflation continuing to run above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. That's even with housing costs projected to moderate. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Moderna's product sales for 2023 modestly beat analyst estimates as it eked out a bigger U.S. market share for COVID shots, though the biotech giant reiterated a downbeat outlook for the year ahead. Moderna shares, they are gaining for a third day. Right now we have got Moderna shares up by 3.2%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading higher with the S&P up 34, up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Governor Ron DeSantis sure thought he was onto something when he announced that he had accomplished the full Grassley. He pulled it off. All 99 counties in Iowa. That takes some doing. Ask Rick Davis. You got to drive a long way to get to some of these places. And he did it. He promised, and he made good on his promise. Not that we were there in all 99 counties. Different version, Vivek Ramaswamy's doing 10 events a day right now. And then you've got the others. If you look at the way activities in Iowa, campaigning in Iowa, has resulted in polling numbers, you wonder why anyone ever goes to the state, if they're running at least. Ron DeSantis claiming, as I mentioned, all 99 counties, just like Ted Cruz did. Nikki Haley has held 51 events during the past year. And she's the one we're talking about potentially giving Donald Trump a run for his money. By the way, Donald Trump, the clear frontrunner, has held 24 events in Iowa, far fewer than any of his challengers. Pretty sure he never spent the night there as we reassemble our panel with 1 week to go. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. And Rick, I wonder where your head is here with 1 week out. There was some hope that Nikki Haley could at least put a dent in Donald Trump's lead in Iowa that she could carry into New Hampshire. Do you still see that as a possibility?
Yeah, I think she can still pretty much create a narrative around her campaign that she's got momentum. And the way to do that is coming in second. She's, neck and neck with Ron DeSantis right now in the high teens. One of them's going to come out ahead. If it's Nikki, she can then claim, see, my momentum is real. And that'll help boost her going into next week's or week after next contest in New Hampshire. So that's really the eye on the ball for her, is a potential whipping of Donald Trump in New Hampshire, but Iowa can certainly help get her there.
How important is this second place finish then, Jeannie? We talked about this with Will Hurd a bit earlier. There's going to be a lot of talk about moral victories, right? Even if Donald Trump wins, how close do you need to come to be seen as the other winner, if you will?
It's critically important. But on Will Hurd for 1 second, could we just say, I looked at the weather and he's right. They're saying Sunday -9 in Des Moines and Monday -12. I don't remember it being that cold 4 years ago. I'm frightened.
You're going to be there.
Putting that aside, yeah, we're going to be there. I don't know what to wear now. But putting that all less important stuff aside. The reality is this is a fight for second place. And I think those numbers that you were just talking about these candidates who have done so many, like DeSantis and Ramaswamy, so many events in Iowa and are not seeing the results in the polls, that raises a larger question about the future of Iowa, I think, because, of course, not just because it's cold, but, Democrats have already moved beyond Iowa, given what happened 4 years ago this time around. And you wonder if Donald Trump does come out double digits ahead, is that going to change the calculus on Iowa going forward in 4 years? So I think even beyond what we see with the nomination this year, there's going to be a lot of ramifications for how we indeed see a calendar pan out 4 years from now in terms of Iowa's import that's been so much debated on the Democratic side this time around.
Rick, this is a real factor. 6-7 degrees below zero, teens below with the wind chill. When it comes to turnout, right? Would you be concerned about this if you were gearing up for votes a week out? And what can campaigns do about that? You start lining up heated vans to try to get people to caucus sites. What's the answer?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, as you point out, Iowa is an organizational state, right? It's all about getting bodies into seats at the caucuses. And a large turnout would clearly benefit what is basically the incumbent running for re-election, and that's Donald Trump. The more caucus goers, the better it is for him. If he could get to 150,000 caucus goers, it'd be huge for him. If it drops below 100,000 caucus goers, maybe better for DeSantis and Nikki Haley, because likelihood is that the people in the suburban areas who don't have to travel very far, are more likely to go out on a really cold night like that than people out in the urban areas who have to sometimes drive quite a ways just to get to the site. And of course, the rural areas are where the strength of Donald Trump's vote is. So we don't have to really think too hard to remember, that even Senator from Florida beat Donald Trump in 3 of these urban counties in 2016. So that's kind of the Nikki Haley theory was, can I get these urban areas to vote for me? And we'll see. But whether it does have an effect.
Was that Ted Cruz, you mean, or Jeb Bush when you're talking who Donald Trump
Rubio.
was running against there?
Rubio.
Oh, Marco Rubio, of course.
Yeah, he's much more the Nikki Haley type than either of the others.
How true. Fascinating. I was trying to figure out if it was the state or the position that I was getting wrong. Marco Rubio. How quickly we forget, Jeannie. My goodness, we didn't even know who won that caucus for a couple of weeks, as I remember. What's on your mind as we head into what could be an epically cold exercise here and the dysfunction in Washington that'll be happening at the same time? How does that inform what we're going to see next Monday?
I think it does. We do know the Trump campaign has had a real active get out the caucus operation on the ground, unlike in 2016. They're hoping that can make up for the weather to a certain extent. They're also trying to get out new people to the caucuses. That's an educational exercise in and of itself. But I think another thing to keep in mind on the Republican side is they don't have to do what the Democrats would, which is vote publicly. They do it privately by secret ballot. And in my mind, I do think how much is that factoring in to whether people who are telling pollsters they're going to support Donald Trump, the incumbent, as Rick mentioned, for all intents and purposes, but do something else privately when not everybody's looking. So to your earlier point, the second place is critically important because if Haley or DeSantis can get much closer than expected and beat those odds, Donald Trump is going to have a fight on his hands as he moves to New Hampshire.
And in the caucus themselves, of course, second place can be a most powerful thing, as we'll discuss when we start addressing the mechanics here of the caucuses later on in the week. I've got my eyes, though, on that South Carolina number from Emerson. Trump 54, Haley 25. That could be a tough moment if they don't move between now and then. Just a couple of weeks off, too. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Some final thoughts next here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Boeing is slumping the most in more than a year after its 737 MAX 9 model was temporarily grounded by authorities following a January 5th incident involving a recently delivered airliner. Boeing shares, they are trading lower now by 6.95%. We'll call it 7%. Right now we have got Boeing down. Spirit Aerosystems Holdings, which makes the fuselage for Boeing 737, is lower as well. Right now, we've got shares of Spirit Aero trading lower by 7.1%. And Alaska Air Group down by 0.6%. Stocks are moving higher with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing. Boeing, of course, member of the Dow. Dow Industrials now up by about 0.8%. It is an up day, as I mentioned, for the U.S. stock market. Dow, S&P, NASDAQ all gaining. 10-year yield right now, 3.99%. Instacart will show ads on the high-tech shopping carts called Capa Carts that it sells to grocery stores. Vijay Simo is chairman and CEO of Instacart. And on Bloomberg Television this morning, she discussed the move.
We're really expanding into building technologies for the store because what we believe is that customers are not going to shop just online or just in store. They're going to shop omni-channels, and the retailers who really create the best, most seamless omni-channel experience are the retailers that are going to gain an edge, and Instacart is giving them this edge.
And those are our top company stories, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington, where Kaylee Lyons will join the conversation in just 5 minutes for Hour 2 of Sound On. Right now, let's bring you up to date on world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. I have a little more on Boeing. Air safety investigators have retrieved the fuselage panel that blew off an Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX. And as Bloomberg Surf Chapman reports, similar aircraft remain grounded for inspection.
As with the Japanese plane that was evacuated during a fire, Elaine Becker, analyst with the firm Cowen, said in a Bloomberg interview there were no serious injuries in the Alaska incident.
Every time there's an incident, there's an investigation. There's no cover-up. Alaska Air's pilots were able to declare an emergency, turn around, land safely. That's hugely significant. No other industry does the deep dive into accidents. Aviation does. I think aviation is still the safest form of transportation.
Investigators are also looking into the air pressurization warnings that were noted on previous flights, though there was no danger. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
The grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX has forced the cancellation of hundreds of Alaska and United Airlines flights. The Biden administration apparently has no plans of getting rid of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, even though he was in the hospital last week, and the Pentagon took 4 days to inform the president. Politico says the president is sticking with Austin. Bloomberg opinion columnist Bobby Ghosh says a cabinet member should not keep an illness secret in this day and age.
We're being told that the secretary's assistant was themselves sort of in bed with the flu, and this is where all the communications broke down. That does not strike me as a satisfactory answer, that if one person has the flu, the president is kept in the dark. That can't be right.
Hear more from Bloomberg opinion columnist Bobby Ghosh on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast. A source says Austin's team understands its handling of the secretary's illness was unacceptable and it cannot happen again. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
Okay, Nancy, thank you. As we prepare for the Iowa caucuses 1 week from today, we're just talking about it with the panel. That's where Donald Trump was over the weekend, talking about an issue that we've been hearing about, the Civil War. We talked about it with Will Hurd as Nikki Haley tries to clean up the answer that she gave to a questioner in New Hampshire about this. Donald Trump decided to tackle the Civil War during a stump speech in Iowa. He called it fascinating. He said that he loves seeing it, and then made clear that he believes, I guess he could have prevented it, because he says it could have been negotiated. Here's the former president.
I said, this is something that could have been negotiated, you know, and it was just for all those people to die, and they died viciously. That was a vicious, vicious war. And in many ways, look, they're all this nothing nice about it. But boy, that was a tough one for our country. But I think it's Abraham Lincoln. Of course, if you negotiated it, you probably wouldn't even know who Abraham Lincoln was.
And of course, it always comes down to fame when we're talking about presidents in American history. Final thoughts from our panel here, with apologies in advance, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. Jeannie, he says that he could negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, so I guess they're kind of the same.
They are kind of the same. He also said he could have beaten Lincoln by 20, 30 points, double digits. I love all of the chyrons of the media saying Trump said this about the Civil War, but historians disagree, as if we needed the reminder. It is, I'm confused by the Republicans' fascination and obsession with the Civil War, given it's 2024. But here we go. It's going to be a year.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is. It's just amazing to me, though, Rick, that he just remains the exception. Nikki Haley's still apologizing for what she said. Donald Trump shows up with this and might well win by quite a bit on Monday.
Yeah, it's stunning to me. I'm sure his negotiated strategy is the South can keep slavery in the places that it's at, and the Russians can keep the parts of Ukraine they've already won over in war. I mean, this is the kind of president we're looking forward to having in the next cycle as Republicans. Over my left shoulder is Abraham Lincoln, founder of the Republican Party. You would be shocked.
Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano. Hour 2 of Sound On starts now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on Bloomberg Radio.
The government's set to begin shutting down a week from Friday. Can we stop the gaslighting? Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As congressional leaders announce a deal on top-line spending levels. Have you seen this? They're the same numbers former Speaker Kevin McCarthy hammered out with Joe Biden last summer. We'll get you up to speed on the spending debate and chances for a breakthrough on a border deal this week. In conversation with Jack Fitzpatrick from Bloomberg Government, he's back with us. Insights from Mick Mulvaney, the former congressman, co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, and former acting chief of staff in the Trump White House, weighs in. 1 week to Iowa. 1 week from today, we'll look at final days of campaigning before first votes are cast with Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. And later this hour, we're going to talk to Bloomberg Pentagon reporter Peter Martin. A fascinating story here as the White House tries to answer criticism now over the whereabouts of our Secretary of Defense. It's all happening today in Washington. And we bring you up to date first on Wall Street. Let's go to New York to hear about trading from Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Best level of the day, up and to the right for U.S. stocks. S&P now up by 40, up by 0.9%. Dow Industrials overcoming earlier losses, up now by 31 points, up by 0.1%. And NASDAQ up 251 points. That is a gain right now of 1.7%. 10-year yield 3.99%. The 2-year, 4.33%. Spot gold down $18 the ounce to $2,027, a decline of 0.9%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 4.2%, $70.71 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin now surging by 6.1%. 46,945 on Bitcoin. So U.S. stocks are pushing higher. Techs are rallying at the start of a week that brings us key inflation data along with bank earnings on Friday. Jim Bianco is the president of Bianco Research. He says you cannot ignore the effects of higher interest rates.
I think we got to start thinking about interest rates trending north as opposed to trending south. That ended, like I said, with the pandemic a couple of years ago. And as it does, we're going to see, especially interest costs, become a bigger problem. They just went over $1 trillion on a yearly basis that the government is going to be paying in interest, which is more than the Defense Department budget right now.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Golf legend Tiger Woods' nearly 3-decade partnership with Nike has come to an end. Woods made the announcement in a statement posted on X. Woods signed his most recent deal with Nike, worth $200 million in 2013. Woods says, yes, there will be another chapter. Nike shares, they're up now by 0.8%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. Right now, we've got Bitcoin very close to $47,000. Bitcoin did rise above that threshold for the first time since April of 2022. Again, the S&P up 40, up 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, joined by Kaylee Lyons. It's good to see you, Kaylee. It sounds weird, although Will Hurd told me it was not too late to be saying Happy New Year. So I'm going to say Happy New Year to you because I haven't I haven't seen you first.
That's fair. Happy New Year, Joe. But
I am struggling with that a little bit. You go to the gas pump, you're at the store. Do you do the or are we beyond that?
I think you have 1 week.
So we're beyond that.
And I think we're beyond.
I won't.
But I appreciate the well wishes for my year. It's going to be a doozy, Joe. You and I both know it.
Yeah, we're about to go through a lot. And, we start spinning the plates now. Senate's getting back to town today, House tomorrow. People called into work over the weekend because there's a deal on top-line spending levels. And I find this really funny. I did a whole thing last hour on gaslighting and the movie Gaslight in 1944 that feels like as the gas lights were dimming without anyone touching them. And this poor woman was driven crazy by her husband who was moving things in the night. That's what's going on here. Now, I'm glad we have Jack Fitzpatrick because maybe he can pull me in off the ledge. But they agreed to $1.59 trillion, I believe.
Correct.
Which is exactly the same thing they agreed on last June when Kevin McCarthy was Speaker.
Right.
Same fiscal year, same
$773 billion non-defense discretionary spending.
Right. Then remember the side deal?
Well, there's that too, yes.
They codified the side deal. So it's exactly the same plan that we had last June.
But Mike Johnson would tell you they got $16 billion in savings from
those are the
pulling
rescissions,
forward
right?
That IRS funding cut of $10 billion and then rescinding
money.
the $6 billion in COVID relief money. Yes.
I don't think that's a real big difference. That's a rounding error is what that is.
Well,
but that's why we have Jack to help us
exactly.
out. Who held forth, I understand, like a hero and a captain in the chair last week. Great to see you, Jack. Dare I say Happy New Year.
We're in it.
Is it just me, or are we playing games with the same numbers here?
It is a re-agreement more than anything else.
I like that. Okay.
You
that
said
sounds
rounding
better than
error
gaslighting
before, and they've been arguing for months over things you could probably call a rounding error. The
Fair enough.
Side deal is a little shy of $70 billion in extra spending.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the government is going to spend. It's hard to even keep track what we're going into 4, 5, 6 trillion. This is all the discretionary numbers. Is it 1.59 trillion versus 1.65 trillion? They've been arguing and risking shutdowns and slinging mud over a relatively small pot of money in the grand scheme of things, but that is what the argument has been since June or so, and now they have re-agreed to basically the same numbers, more or less, as they struck in late May, early June.
Okay, so maybe we're calling this a win, even though I'm not really sure it should be a win. But the idea is this helps take a step at least toward averting a shutdown. The thing is, top-line figures are one thing, then you have to divvy that up, turn that into legislative text, and get that past both chambers before actually January 19th and funding runs out. So how much of the hard work is still ahead when it was this hard to agree to the deal that was already agreed to in the first place?
This was probably the hardest question for them to answer, and they answered it, and that's good, but there are still very hard questions to answer. It's probably debatable, really, whether this was the hardest. They are still going to have fights over policy riders. Mm-hmm. How much do you want to get into the tough policy measures, not just dollars and how much you're going to spend, but the big ones over the past year have been abortion access, being legislated through some of these spending bills. The FBI, there are conservatives who are hesitant to fund the FBI without policy riders. There's resentment over the FBI vis-a-vis Donald Trump's legal troubles. There is not an agreement now on how they are going to broadly approach policy riders. So any policy measure they could fight over, they can still fight over it. Also, as you mentioned, they agreed to a defense and non-defense number. They didn't divvy that up into the 12 appropriations bills. How do they divide that up for an allocation for each of those bills, which has an effect on what kind of programs get more money and less money? That's something that they still have to do. And it's not a lot of time until January 19th. So there are still plenty of hurdles for them.
But possibly you're not covering a shutdown this time.
It's very good news. Yesterday's news was a big, broad step.
Well, this is
toward
encouraging
not
to me
shutting
then,
the government.
Kaylee. I'm a naysayer. I'm accusing people of gaslighting. Jack, who does this for a living, is encouraged.
Okay. We'll take Jack's word for it.
Absolutely. Great to see you. Jack Fitzpatrick, don't be a stranger. I know you won't be. I'm wondering what Mick has to think and has to say about all of this, because we have 8 legislative days.
Yep.
I haven't even brought up the border yet, by the way. 8 legislative days. Remembering, though, we have 2 dates. So we do a little shutdown for a couple of days after the first one and get it done potentially by February 2nd. Mick Mulvaney, of course, co-founder of the Freedom Caucus and former acting chief of staff in the White House, former budget director. I'm just going to say Happy New Year because I started all of this and I'm just coming back today, Mick. It's great to see you. Does this sound like a shutdown that can be averted?
No. Does it sound like shutdown's been averted? No. I'm not really sure. I was sitting here. I was in Louisiana yesterday for the swearing in of Jeff Landry, a Republican governor, who's also a Tea Party member class of 2010. So sort of old home week. But a couple of those folks are still in Congress, and they were all scratching their head as to where Mike Johnson got the $1.66 trillion deal. Keep in mind, Mike Johnson was also there yesterday because he's from Louisiana as well. So I'm not sure. I'm looking at Chip Roy's page here today, and he says, look, it all depends on the policy deals we get as part of this spending deal. I can't imagine what policy deals they're going to get. It seems to me if you're going to avoid a shutdown, it's going to follow the same exact model that it has for the last decade, which is all the Democrats will vote for it, a couple of Republicans will vote for it, and the Republicans will start an internal bloodbath over it. So if that's what avoiding a shutdown means, I think that's what you've got.
Okay, so you are envisioning an internal bloodbath here, Mick. Not exactly a pretty picture you're painting, but for Mike Johnson specifically, knowing the fate of his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, who passed a deal with Democratic support and lost the gavel as a result, do you really think he's staring down that same threat? Can House conservatives stomach another speaker fight?
If they were rational, the answer to that question would be no, but I don't think Matt Gaetz is a rational actor in all of this. I'm not sure how, if they really made the case that they got rid of McCarthy because of policy shortcomings, that he was incapable of cutting a good deal with Democrats or with the White House, and that it wasn't about something personal between Matt and McCarthy. Matt always said it was about policy. If it really was about policy, it strikes me that the same policy that got McCarthy fired just got agreed to again. So I'm not really sure what the argument is not to do anything different than what they did to Kevin.
Well, that's interesting. The Freedom Caucus calls it a total fail, suggesting that, and it's clear that Mike Johnson, Mick, will need Democrats to pass this. So now we really have created the same exact scenario in which Kevin McCarthy got fired. But that was before we went through Steve Scalise and Tom Emmer and Jim Jordan. I don't mean to ask the same question that Kaylee just asked, but who else is there?
There isn't anybody. But of course, that's not, again, that's a rational question to ask about this. If you're simply trying to stop this from happening, which a couple of folks probably would be interested in doing, then trying to get rid of the speaker throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing. The question the conservatives are going to be asking is, how is this different? Mike Johnson has got to be able to go to them with something and say, look, here's why you should keep me. I've just cut a deal that does X, Y, and Z, and that is better than the deal you would have gotten under Kevin McCarthy, and that's why I should stay. I don't know what that deal is yet because the number's bigger. I mean, the number is actually bigger than they agreed to. I think it was 159, and now it's 166. Of course, that side deal I thought was supposed to be just a handshake and a secret. It wasn't anything that the House voted on. So technically, I guess you could make the case that Mike Johnson is spending more, not the same. If you want to say that the side agreement technically was an agreement because the McCarthy and Schumer don't have the ability to cut those types of deals. So it's really ugly. I hear what everybody's saying. It sounds like it's certainly a move in the right direction towards avoiding a shutdown. I'm not sure it's anywhere near the end of the discussion.
Well, and Mick, doesn't it all hinge on the border anyway? When you have members of the Republican conference saying HR2 or bust, no security, no funding, shut down the border or shut down the government, it seems that everything is about the border here.
It could be. Now, you could also make the argument, I think you could make it plausibly, that they always want to talk about the border. They sort of, and I'm talking about the Republicans now, they sort of have at least tacitly, if nothing else, given into this concept of mirroring the border discussions up with funding for Ukraine, Israel, to a lesser extent Taiwan, right? That those four pieces seem to be stuck together. Yes, they would love to have a second bite at the apple. I just don't know how they do it. And of course, if you say, well, we have to have HR2 in order to pass anything out of the House, then nothing will pass out of the House because the Senate will never pass HR2. So I hear what you're saying, but I think that maybe the spending deal will be isolated from at least the discussion about HR2 because that has sort of been married now to Ukraine and Israel.
To what extent is Donald Trump helping to direct the conversation here, Mick? Last time we spoke, it was shortly after we learned that Mike Johnson was in regular contact with him. We heard him talk about the border quite a bit over the weekend in Iowa. Do we at this point really think that he's going to endorse any deal that might make Joe Biden or any Democrat look good?
No, and I think it's one of the reasons you hear him. I haven't seen anything out of him today about the spending deal. I think he's waiting to see how it's received. And when it's received badly by conservatives, he's going to attack it. He might also wait to see what Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are saying about it. But my guess is they'll attack it as well. So no, I don't think Trump is interested. And look, that's not unusual in politics, right? There's a couple House members over the weekend who said they weren't interested in doing a border deal now because it would give Biden the victory too close to the election. That's not unusual. I dealt with the same thing with Democrats when I was in the White House in 2019 and early 2020. They didn't want to give Trump any wins, that close to election. So that's certainly politics as usual. But no, I don't think Donald Trump is interested in brokering a deal here. When he was running for office the first time, he was, against all the spending deals. When he was in office, he was for all the spending deals. When he was out of office, he was against the spending deals again. So I think you continue to see that trend.
Well, Mick, you just mentioned there Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, keeping in mind that you're speaking with us exactly 1 week out from the Iowa caucuses. Do either of them stand a real chance?
If I was looking for an upset, Kaylee, it would be in DeSantis. I don't think any of them. I don't think Nikki or Ron has a chance to beat Trump. But if you look to folks who overperform versus underperform, keep in mind Donald Trump underperformed badly in 2016. I think it was 12 points or something like that. And Ted Cruz overperformed by about the same amount, in large part because Cruz understood how caucuses were different than primaries, and Trump, at that time, a first-time candidate, really didn't. Now, Trump is working really, really hard to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again in 2024. But that being said, a lot of Cruz's team has signed on with DeSantis. So if there's a chance for anybody to overperform next Monday, I'll be looking for Ron to overperform. If he doesn't and he finishes third, then I think he's out of the race. I think you have to finish second in Iowa to move on to Super Tuesday. It looks like he's not going to finish second in New Hampshire. He may finish fourth in New Hampshire or fifth. But I will watch to see if DeSantis overperforms. I don't think he's got a chance to beat Trump, but he may do better than the polling is showing.
Well, just in our last minute here, Mick, I wonder your thoughts on your home state, South Carolina. Emerson has Trump at 54, Haley at 25. If she can't outperform a number like that in her home state, is it over?
Oh, Joe, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that question. Everybody always wants to talk about Iowa and New Hampshire. Every now and then folks realize that South Carolina comes next. And the dirty little secret down here is that, Trump is going to crush her. She's done really, really well the last couple of months. And I do think she's got a chance to pull within maybe single digits in New Hampshire. She's had a nice effort there. But South Carolina is Trump state. South Carolina is Trump country. 100% Trump is winning this state.
I guess I shouldn't be surprised to hear that, but it's always news when we hear it from Mick Mulvaney. It's good to see you, Mick. Thank you for the insights. As always, Mick Mulvaney on Sound On. We do this conversation each Monday, myself and Kaylee with Mick, and we'll do it again when we head to Iowa. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are higher. The Dow and S&P very close to session highs right now. For the S&P 500 index, we are looking at a 44-point jump right now. That is a gain of just about 1%. The Dow up 71 now, up 0.2%. The Nasdaq 100 index up 279, up 1.7%. Nasdaq Composite also higher by 1.7%, while the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up now by about 1.5%. 10-year yield 3.99%. The 2-year 4.33%. Gold down $17 the ounce to $2,028, drop of 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude now down 3.9%, 70.86 for a barrel of WTI. Merck has agreed to acquire cancer drug maker Harpoon Therapeutics for $680 million as it seeks to solidify its leadership position in the profitable oncology space. Merck shares, they're down now by 0.4%. HARP is surging 112%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Keely Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
1 week until actual people vote, and you'll hear us still talk about polls, but just to think what it'll feel like after all this time talking about the candidates and the campaigns, where we really stand in Iowa. Then a week later, we fast forward to New Hampshire, and we're going to be coming to you live from both locations. You know who's going to beat us to both locations, Kaylee, is Nancy.
Yes.
Nancy Cook, of course, helping to spearhead our coverage on the campaign trail and has been incredible covering the Trump camp, the DeSantis camp. Mm-hmm. And so we had to talk to her with 1 week out, right? Because you and I are busy shopping for winter coats right now. And boots, gloves, hats. Nancy's going down there to talk to the campaigns. Nice to see you. I'm guessing that your parka is ready. And it's one thing for us to joke about, we're all going to be cold and all that, but this could be an actual turnout issue, as we were talking with Rick Davis last hour. I realize it's cold in Iowa, but teens below zero could actually impact people's decisions next Monday.
Absolutely. This is going to be one of the coldest caucus nights, or at least it's projected to be, in like the last 30 years.
How lucky we are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
how about it?
how lucky we are. And so, but the tricky thing is that the Trump, has a huge amount of support in Iowa, but there is a block of his supporters who are first-time caucus goers. And I know that the Trump campaign is privately worried about that turnout issue. Not that, I don't think they're worried that he won't win, but they want to be able to say that he won by a huge margin. And in order for him to do that, he has to get all of his supporters out, including these first-time caucus goers. So they have done a ton of training with people to educate them about how to caucus. They've made a 3-minute video about how to caucus. And I think their concern is, if you're a first-time caucus goer and you've read all these news stories about how far ahead Trump is in the polls, and it's a little chilly, do you go out and caucus, or do you think he doesn't need me and you stay in your nice warm house? And so I think that this is a real challenge for the Trump people.
Okay, so if Trump basically thinks his victory in Iowa is assured and it really is just going to be about the margin, what margin would feel like a loss for him, even with a win, if that makes sense? When he's polling 50% plus, if he doesn't breach 50%, if someone comes in, say 20 points of him, is that what's disappointing?
Well, I think that what they want, they want a blowout victory. And they are, I think people are really measuring them with the polls. Like, does he get more than 50%? Can he show that his base is larger than sort of the 30 to 35% that he had before? What the Trump campaign wants people to focus on, including reporters, is, how's he won? What is the biggest margin compared to the second? So the largest margin between first place and second place in an Iowa caucus is 12.5%. That was Bob Dole. And so they really want people to focus on that metric. I can tell you that in the Bloomberg newsroom, we're looking at the 50%.
Wow. That's saying a lot. and you wonder what's the line in New Hampshire, Iowa picks corn, New Hampshire picks presidents. There's a long history of Iowa not picking the person who would eventually become the nominee. So there are questions we're asking about, well, what happens to everybody else here, right? Can Nikki Haley get out with enough credibility to perform well in New Hampshire and still be in the conversation? And then there's Ron DeSantis, and I know you've spent a lot of time with the DeSantis campaign. They've really leaned into Iowa. He's been to all 99 counties now, famously, the full Grassley, and it's not looking like he's going to do terribly well, although Mick Mulvaney's got his eyes on him, as we just heard, Kaylee. But listen to Ron DeSantis speaking earlier today with Rachel Scott at ABC News about whether or not this is it.
If you do not place first or second place, are you staying in this race?
We're in it for the long haul.
In it for the long haul, regardless.
Absolutely. I'd like to be the underdog, so I'm just letting that sit. Let people say what they want.
But do you believe you can win?
We've done it right, and we're gonna do well.
In it for the long haul. Is that just what you say when you're running for president, or does he have the money to actually do that?
That's what you have to say when you're running for president, and he has invested so many resources in Iowa. Yeah. The problem for him is that the money is starting to dry up. I think that his momentum in Iowa, when I've talked to people on the ground there today, there is a feeling in Iowa that like his campaign has stalled. There's not the same level of excitement around him. So, he may be reluctant to quit. He may not want to be a quitter, but I think the donor money is very quickly going to dry up if he does not place second in Iowa. And I was even told if he doesn't come within like 10 percentage points of Trump. Wow. Like he has to place very strong. And I just think at this point, that seems like a real
defying gravity.
Defying gravity. I mean, just back to your question about Nikki Haley, what we saw this week is that she is starting to pull consistently in the second place in Iowa. And so what I'm looking for is, can she pull off a second place finish in Iowa? What is that margin between, if she comes in second and Trump, what does that look like? And then she has huge momentum going into New Hampshire. New Hampshire is like really her, much more her scene than DeSantis is. It's a more moderate state. People like her.